Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is your friend Greedy Fanfics, bringing you another fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the first part of What If Deku Had a Eliatrope Quirk. All credit for this story goes to the original authors, so please support them by checking out the link in the description for more details. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. It all started when Izuku turned 4. His friends enthusiastically and energetically showed off their quirks every day, with Katsuki Bakugo leading the way. Katsuki blatantly boasted about his blasts and loudly proclaimed that he had the best quirk for becoming a hero. He enjoyed being the center of attention and never missed an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority to others, especially Izuku. Izuku and Katsuki used to be close friends, but since Katsuki developed his quirk, he seemed to have changed. He treated Izuku increasingly condescendingly, as if he were worth less because his own quirk had not yet appeared. It was hard for Izuku to understand why his friend had suddenly become so hostile, and it hurt him to see how far they had grown apart. Izuku Midoriya was starting to worry. She noticed that Izuku was often lost in thought lately, especially when the other kids were proudly displaying their quirks. But despite the difficulties, there was a spark of hope in him. Izuku saw him talking about All Might with shining eyes and dreaming of becoming a great hero one day. Even on days when he was sad, he never seemed to give up on that dream. He continued to ask countless questions about quirks and heroes, and Izuku hoped fervently that this unwavering spark of hope and curiosity would help him stay strong. When Izuku turned 5, Izuku decided to take him to see a quirk doctor. It was unusual in his generation for a quirk not to have manifested itself by this age. In preschool, Izuku began to suffer increasingly from the teasing of the other children. Izuku was particularly hurt that even Katsuki, the son of her best friend Mitsuki, teased her little angel. Not so long ago, Izuku and Katsuki had been inseparable. But during her friend's last few visits, Izuku had noticed how Katsuki had changed around her son. She had overheard the little blastmaker call Izuku Deku several times, a nickname that meant something like useless and was a pejorative reading of his name. This change weighed heavily on her. Izuku knew how cruel children can be, and how much society discriminated against those without quirks. Even though there was officially no discrimination, people without quirks were often perceived as less valuable and useful. An incident she remembered well illustrated this clearly. A man without a quirk who worked for a government agency was regularly passed over when it came to responsible tasks. Although he was obviously competent and highly qualified, his colleagues did not seem to take him seriously. It was as if the mere absence of a quirk automatically devalued him. People without quirks usually only got poorly paid jobs, even if they had excellent grades and degrees. Izuku could never understand this injustice, especially since the use of quirks was strictly regulated in public. Outside of their own four walls, most people were hardly allowed to use their quirks. Only heroes had the right to use their quirks in public, and even they had to undergo a long and difficult training. For certain professions, it was possible to obtain a special permit to use a quirk, but this test was expensive, complicated, and had to be renewed every 3 years. Izuku found it even harder to understand why quirkless people were so often discriminated against. Perhaps it was the media, which often subtly portrayed quirkless people as weaker, less resilient, or even less intelligent. This thought weighed on her as she reflected on social inequality. Izuku was wide awake early in the morning because today was the long-awaited visit to the quirk doctor. A mixture of excitement and nervousness had kept him up half the night. Would he finally learn what his quirk was? Or would it turn out that he was indeed quirkless and useless, just as Kachan always said? These tormenting thoughts would not leave him. "Mom, come on, we're going to be late," Izuku urged impatiently, his voice full of excitement, similar to when he wanted to persuade her to watch All Might's debut video for the 1000th time. "Take it easy, my little darling. We still have plenty of time," Izuku reassured him with a smile, while she searched her handbag one last time to make sure she had everything important with her. A few minutes later, mother and sons left the small apartment and got into the car. Izuku stared out the window during the drive, but the passing cityscape could hardly distract him. His thoughts raced. What if it turned out that he didn't have a special quirk? Would he ever be able to impress his friends? Would Kachan finally stop teasing him? Beads of sweat gathered in his hands, while hope and fear wrestled with each other like two irreconcilable voices in his head. The drive to the doctor's office was short. Izuku sat quietly in his child's seat, his small hands clenched around the armrests. His gaze wandered out the window as houses and people passed by. The steady hum of the engine had a calming effect, even if his thoughts did not. He noticed colorful cars passing by quickly and birds balancing on the power lines. But even these small observations could not quell the excitement within him. His thoughts revolved around a single question: would he finally find out if he had a quirk? The doctor's waiting room was a welcoming space, brightly lit and decorated with pastel-colored walls that created a calming atmosphere. A comfortable seating area with soft cushions invited you to linger, and colorful pictures of children happily presenting their quirks hung on the walls. In one corner of the room was a shelf filled with toys, building blocks, stuffed animals and small cars, that suggested that young patients in particular visited this doctor. The warm light enhanced the pleasant effect of the room. Izuku let his eyes drift to the toys, but he wasn't interested in them. His thoughts were much too occupied with imagining what the doctor would say about his quirk. With each passing year, it became less and less likely that a quirk would appear, but ᴡᴇ had not given up hope. There were cases, albeit rare ones, in which quirks appeared later or turned out to be different over time than initially assumed. However, these developments usually occurred in people who worked intensively with their quirks, something that rarely occurred in the everyday lives of most people. ᴡᴇ and Izuku didn't have to sit in the waiting room for long, as they had arrived at the doctor's on time, as ᴡᴇ had carefully planned. Midoriya called a young, friendly smiling nurse who appeared in the door. "You can go through to the examination room and sit down. The doctor will be with you in a moment." The examination room was simple but clean and functional. Izuku looked around curiously as he sat down on one of the chairs. His legs dangled excitedly back and forth while ᴡᴇ placed her hand on his in a reassuring manner. A few minutes later, the door opened and the doctor entered the room. He was an older, corpulent man with a round face, thinning hair, and a mustache. His smile was warm and reassuring, and his gentle eyes radiated a patient kindness. He approached his desk with deliberate steps and nodded encouragingly to ᴡᴇ and Izuku. "Good morning, Midoriya family," the doctor greeted them warmly as he closed the door behind him and sat down at his desk. He studied the information on his tablet for a moment before looking up. "I have good news, Mrs. Midoriya," the doctor said with a smile after glancing briefly at his tablet. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as ᴡᴇ involuntarily held her breath and Izuku leaned forward eagerly. The doctor let the silence sink in before finally continuing, "According to the blood tests, your son definitely has a quirk." ᴡᴇ let out a sigh of relief, not realizing that she had been holding her breath. A feeling of relief washed over her as she unconsciously squeezed Izuku's hand a little tighter. Izuku, on the other hand, could hardly stay in his chair. He jumped up, excitedly tugged at his mother's blouse, and jumped up and down with joy. His eyes lit up, and a broad smile spread across his face. All the doubts and burdens of the past few weeks suddenly fell away. He felt valuable, strong, and finally validated. "Mom! Mom! I have a quirk! I have a quirk, Mom," he shouted, his eyes shining as his heart pounded with joy. ᴡᴇ couldn't help but smile as she watched him. The tension of the last few weeks had not only fallen from her, but also from him. She gently stroked his shoulder and nodded. "Yes, my darling, you have." The doctor smiled, letting the joy take effect for a moment, and then continued calmly, "However, we still don't know exactly what your son's quirk does. The blood tests have detected a kind of energy in his body, something that is previously unknown. The amount of this energy was still very small, but it suggests that his body is designed to create and use it. Presumably, Izuku will figure out what his quirk is capable of over time." ᴡᴇ listened carefully as the doctor looked at his tablet and added more information. "We have classified the quirk as an emitter type. However, it is interesting to note that Izuku's body shows several anatomical adaptations. Particularly striking is an additional circulatory system that resembles the bloodstream, but appears to be specifically responsible for this energy. It seems to be designed to conduct the energy through the body and use it." ᴡᴇ's forehead furrowed as she tried to process the information. A separate circulatory system for this energy? Is that something we need to worry about? She asked cautiously. The doctor shook his head slightly. Not at this point. Such mutations are not uncommon in quirks that generate or convert energy. The system appears to be stable, and we have found no evidence that it could affect Izuku's health. Nevertheless, I recommend that we examine it again in a few years to make sure that everything remains in order. Izuku listened carefully to the doctor's explanations, even though he didn't fully understand much of it. His thoughts revolved around one thing: he had a quirk. And he couldn't wait to find out what it could do. Inko frowned slightly before asking the doctor, "I don't understand, doctor. Neither my husband's quirk nor my quirk resembles Izuku's quirk. My husband can breathe fire, and I can draw small objects toward me." The doctor nodded sympathetically. "Your son's quirk seems to have developed independently of yours or your husband's. This is no longer the norm these days, but it happens often enough not to be unusual. A well-known example would be a man who developed a completely new quirk that came from neither his mother nor his father. He can influence metal magnetically, although his parents have a quirk for water and a quirk for plants. Such spontaneous developments are still part of the incredible diversity of quirks." Izuku listened carefully to his mother's conversation with the doctor, even though he didn't fully understand everything. As the two talked for a while, countless questions swirled through his mind. What exactly did this energy mean? Was it useful or perhaps even dangerous? Would it help him become a hero, just like he had always wanted to be? A feeling of confusion mixed with the hope that his quirk could be something very special. Although he was happy to finally have a quirk, he wasn't sure what it could really do. On his way back to the car, he couldn't get the thought out of his head whether his quirk would impress the other children at preschool. So far, he hadn't had anything to impress Kacchan or the others with. Katsuki could create explosions with his sweat, a spectacular and powerful quirk. The other two boys in Katsuki's group also had abilities that were easy to show. One had red wings and could at least float a little, the other could stretch his fingers to 3 to 4 times their length. Izuku, on the other hand, had an ominous energy that might sound interesting, but without showing something tangible, the others would probably think he was lying and didn't really have a quirk. Before they even got home, Izuku was determined to figure out how his quirk worked. He wondered if he could concentrate the energy in his hands or if it would show up spontaneously like it did with Kacchan. Maybe he could do little tests by trying to move or change something, anything that would prove that his quirk was real and useful. The weekend was ahead of him. It was Saturday morning, and preschool didn't start again until Monday. While they were walking to the car, Inko noticed how pensive her son was. She was relieved that he now had a quirk, but at the same time, she felt a little ashamed of that thought. To her, Izuku had always been lovable, with or without a quirk. But now that those worries had finally been laid to rest, she decided to do something special for him. Before they went home, she stopped to do some shopping. She wanted to make katsudon, his favorite food, to show him how much she loved him, especially now that she sensed he was worried about his quirk and what it meant. During the shopping and the rest of the way home, Izuku remained deep in thought. Occasionally, he murmured softly to himself as he continued to wonder what his quirk could do and how he would prove it to the others. When they arrived home, Izuku shouted, "I'm going to practice, Mom," and disappeared straight into his room. Even as he hurried down the hallway, he imagined in his mind how he could feel the mysterious energy within him and perhaps even control it. The idea of finally being able to show something impressive at preschool on Monday filled him with a mixture of hope and determination. His eyes sparkled with ambition as he closed the door behind him. Inko called after him to say that his favorite meal, katsudon, would be served later, but she wasn't sure if he had heard her at all. She stood still for a moment in the quiet apartment, looked at the closed door inside. Her thoughts turned to her husband. Should she tell him the news? The doctor had confirmed that Izuku had a quirk, a real chance of becoming a hero one day, like all the other children. But would he be proud of it? Or would he dismiss it, perhaps even react pejoratively? These conflicting thoughts tore her apart inside, and she couldn't decide whether it would be better to write to him or remain silent. For years, her relationship with her husband had been little more than a shadow of its former self. Officially, they were still married, but the emotional distance was unmistakable. 2 years ago, he had moved to America for his work, originally for a year, but the length of stay was extended again and again. 3 months ago, ᴡᴇ finally found out that he was cheating on her. The moment she learned about it, it felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her feet. Her heart was racing, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still around her. She could hardly breathe, and her thoughts kept revolving around the betrayal. Tears welled up in her eyes, and everything that had held her world together until then shattered into 1,000 pieces. The shock subsided after a few minutes, but the emptiness and pain remained, not just for hours or days, but for weeks. During this time, everything around her felt as if it were shrouded in a dense fog that prevented her from thinking clearly or looking ahead. The plans and hopes she had once shared with her husband suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. It took a while before she found a way to turn the pain into anger, an anger that gave her the strength to move forward. They usually spoke on the phone at fixed times, coordinated with the time difference. But one evening, when ᴡᴇ witnessed Izuku suffering from teasing and feeling helpless, she decided to call her husband spontaneously. She wanted to talk to him, tell him about the pain her son was going through. But when she dialed the number, it was not a familiar voice that answered, but that of a strange woman. It was late at his place, and the woman spoke English in a cheerful, almost sleepy voice. ᴡᴇ paused for a moment before answering in Japanese. "Excuse me, I wanted to speak to my husband." There was a sudden silence at the other end of the line. After a startled hiccup, the woman hung up. ᴡᴇ stared at the phone as if it could provide her with an explanation. But she knew what it meant. She was hit hard by the stab of disappointment, and the bitter taste of reality crept up on her, a truth she had tried so hard to suppress for so long. After the incident, she and her husband had a huge argument, which eventually led to them both agreeing that a divorce was the best solution for everyone. At first, ᴡᴇ was very afraid that her soon-to-be ex-husband might try to take Izuku away from her. But she quickly realized that he had no interest in doing so. On the one hand, she was relieved, because she knew that she could keep Izuku with her. On the other hand, she felt a deep sense of disappointment. It hurt her that his father showed so little interest in the wonderful boy that Izuku was. This lack of commitment hurt her more than she wanted to admit to herself. She secretly wondered if it was because Izuku hadn't shown any quirk yet. ᴡᴇ decided not to tell her estranged husband about her son's quirk, at least not until the divorce was finalized and custody was settled. That shouldn't take much longer. All the paperwork was already prepared and just needed to be signed. Her soon-to-be ex-husband would pay child support, just enough to cover the rent. For the time being, she would have to find a small side job to make up the rest. As soon as Izuku started school, she planned to take a full-time job to better manage the financial burden. That evening, Izuku enjoyed his favorite meal, katsudon, and was full of joy and confidence for the coming week. Everything seemed possible all of a sudden. But with every hour that passed without him noticing the slightest reaction from his quirk, the initial euphoria faded. His forehead furrowed as he tried again and again. He wanted to feel the mysterious energy within him, control it, prove something, but nothing happened. Finally, exhausted and discouraged, he sank to the floor. Tears welled up in his eyes, and the overwhelming disappointment weighed heavily on him. At that moment, he felt just as useless as before. All his hopes of impressing the other children with his quirk seemed to be nothing but a distant, unattainable dream. With a heavy, queasy feeling, he went to bed on Sunday evening. The joy of Monday in preschool was as if extinguished. The next morning, ᴡᴇ gently drew back the curtains and the soft light of the rising sun filled the room. "Izuku, wake up, my darling," she said gently, while she shook his shoulder lightly. But Izuku's concerns had hardly diminished overnight. He still wished he had had more time to practice before he had to face Kacchan and his friends. Unfortunately, Izuku had already told the others about his visit to the quirk doctor. The reactions to this had been unsurprising. Katsuki and the others had only laughed at him and made insulting comments. Now Izuku knew that he had to prepare himself for an unpleasant conversation. His mood worsened when he remembered what Bakugo had said to him the last time they met. "Deku, what's the point? The doctor won't tell you anything different. We all already know that you're flawed and useless and always will be." With those words in his head, Izuku got up and shuffled into the bathroom, where he mechanically got ready while the queasy feeling in his stomach grew. After he had finished in the bathroom, he went to the kitchen. There, ᴡᴇ was preparing a traditional Japanese breakfast for them, as she did every morning. She stirred the miso soup, laid out the nori and prepared the steaming rice. The enticing aroma of freshly grilled salmon filled the room, creating a warm, homely atmosphere. Yet ᴡᴇ couldn't ignore the slight shadows under Izuku's eyes, nor the silence that emanated from him. He sat silently at the table, gazing at the floor as his mind drifted. ᴡᴇ watched him with growing concern. She wondered how she could help her son, who was struggling so much with himself, and desperately sought a way to put a smile on his face. But she knew she couldn't force him to talk about his worries, she could only be there for him and hope that he felt her support. ᴡᴇ noticed the concern in her son's eyes. Even though Izuku tried to hide it, she could feel the burden he was carrying as a mother. She knew he wasn't telling her the whole truth, but she didn't want to press him. Instead, she decided to give him space. Izuku, in turn, saw the deep understanding and warmth in his mother's eyes. This silent support gave him the courage to push the sad thoughts aside for a moment. With a small, this time more sincere smile, he began to eat. The lovingly prepared breakfast distracted him and helped him to focus on something positive. As he took the first bite, Izuku felt a tiny flame of hope flare up inside him. Today might not be perfect, but somewhere deep inside him, he knew he would find the strength to carry on. He had a quirk, maybe it wasn't strong yet, not yet visible to the world. But he was determined to understand it and use it. Eventually, he hoped, he would not only impress his friends but also change the world. After ᴡᴇ dropped him off at preschool and gave him a firm, consoling hug goodbye, Izuku spotted Katsuki and his friends waiting for him. For a moment, he felt a wave of relief. As long as his mother was around, he knew that Kaken would hold back. Her presence was like an invisible shield that gave him security. Izuku clung to this feeling of security, as if it were a saving anchor. It was a strange phenomenon how Bakugo behaved around Izuku's mother. His usual aggressive demeanor gave way to an almost tense calm. He stood stiffly, his hands deep in his pockets, as if he was pulling himself together with all his might so as not to make a scene. His eyes wandered restlessly around, and every now and then he bit his lips briefly, as if he wanted to say something, but then controlled himself. For Izuku, it was fascinating to see how ᴡᴇ's mere presence influenced Katsuki's behavior so strongly. It was as if her presence drew an invisible line that Katsuki did not dare to cross. Izuku remembered how different it was when he visited Katsuki at home. With his own family, Katsuki was unabashedly loud and impulsive, and conversations with his mother often ended in heated arguments. The insults flew back and forth, and the tension in the room was palpable. Masaru Bakugo, Katsuki's father, usually sat quietly and reservedly next to him, hardly saying a word. Nevertheless, both Katsuki's mother and father had always been friendly to Izuku. It almost felt as if they had accepted him as a silent observer of their turbulent household, a part of their everyday life that brought brief moments of normality. Izuku waved goodbye to his mother as her car rounded the corner and finally disappeared from his field of vision. As soon as she was gone, Katsuki approached him, hands in his pockets, his usual arrogant grin on his lips. "Hey, Deku. So? Are you finally crazy?" he asked with his arms crossed, his eyes flashing with a mixture of curiosity and what Izuku thought was nervousness. For a brief moment, it almost seemed as if Kaken was actually unsure. But the expression disappeared as quickly as it had come, and Katsuki had put his smug mask back on. Izuku swallowed and felt his heart beat faster. "Yes, Kaken," he began cautiously, "the doctor said I have a screw loose." For a split second, he saw a tiny smile cross Katsuki's face, real and unfiltered. "That's great," Katsuki whispered so softly that Izuku almost thought he had imagined it. But immediately Katsuki cleared his throat and continued with a louder, demanding tone, "Then show us what you can do." The words made Izuku stop. Panic shot through his body like a wave. His heart pounded violently in his chest, his hands trembled slightly. Katsuki had really been happy, hadn't he? Had he perhaps hoped that Izuku really could do something? Or was it just a mask, another game? Izuku didn't know. The insecurity gnawed at him, and the fear of disappointing Katsuki lay like a heavy burden on his shoulders. "The doctor said that my quirk is some kind of energy that's in my body, Izuku finally began to explain, his voice trembling. Why did he have to start stuttering now? He felt his words slipping away. But I haven't been able to produce anything yet. With every word, he watched Katsuki's expression change. The initial interest and hint of pride gave way to disappointment. Finally, only contempt remained. Katsuki snorted and spat out the words like poison, just as I thought, Deku. The nickname Katsuki had given him sounded harsher and more hurtful than ever. We've all been using our quirks for a year now and they've been working. But you? You can't even do a little with yours. You really are useless. Izuku felt tears well up in his eyes as he tried to suppress the rising wave of shame and disappointment. But Katsuki's words had cut him deeply, and the weight of his insecurities suddenly felt crushing. Still, he raised his head, his voice quivering but full of determination. Kaken, I'll learn to use my quirk. I'll become a hero, I just know it. I can feel it. His words hung in the air, and although his heart was racing, Izuku stood firm. He would not give up, even though Kaken's contempt hit him harder than he wanted to admit. Katsuki's expression darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. Almost shouting, he hurled the words at Izuku. You? A hero? Forget it. A hero needs a strong quirk, like me. Not a whining baby like you. What was I thinking, that we could become heroes together? You're just a millstone around my neck. With these words, Katsuki turned around abruptly and marched in the direction of preschool. His friends, who had watched the whole scenario in silence, gave Izuku a quick, hesitant glance, as if they wanted to say something. But not one of them spoke a word. Instead, they hurried after Katsuki without even looking back. Izuku remained frozen. The words echoed in his head, each of them stinging like a knife. Finally, he collapsed, tears streaming down his face. Everything inside him hurt, not only the words, but also the cold certainty that Katsuki had actually given up on him. It felt like a part of him had broken, a part he could no longer put back together. A counselor who had noticed him hurried over. When she saw Izuku sitting in front of the school building, crying, she carefully knelt down next to him. Her voice was gentle and full of concern. Izuku, what happened? Are you all right? She asked soothingly. But Izuku couldn't answer. The words stuck in his throat like a lump, his sobs barely letting him catch his breath. It took quite a while before he was even able to respond to her questions. Finally, with a slight sob, he shook his head. No. Please don't call my mother, he murmured softly. His voice was shaky, but firm. He didn't want to worry his mother. He didn't want her to worry about him anymore. I feel better, he added, although his shaky voice gave him away. The caretaker looked at him sympathetically. She obviously didn't believe him, but she didn't push him further. Instead, she stayed at his side for a moment before giving him a gentle look and finally going back into the building. Izuku remained alone, trying to gather himself, and swearing quietly that one day he would prove everyone wrong. The day dragged on like chewing gum for Izuku, every minute seemed to last forever. None of the other children spoke to him, not even fleetingly. During the breaks, he sat alone on a bench and watched from afar as the other children laughed and played. The feeling of isolation gnawed at him, relentlessly and heavily. It was especially painful to see his former friends enjoying themselves together, as if he had never belonged. The counselor tried to start a conversation with him a few times, but Izuku barely responded. His gaze remained downcast, and he withdrew into his own silent world. That afternoon, when Inko picked up her son, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. His face was blank, his shoulders drooped, and he avoided looking her in the eye. She carefully put him in the car and said, Izuku, wait in the car for a moment. I want to talk to your teacher for a moment. However, the counselor was unable to tell the worried mother much about the background to the incident. She only knew that there had been an argument between Izuku and another child that morning. But since she hadn't witnessed the fight herself and none of the other children were willing to talk about it, much remained unclear. What she had observed, however, was the subdued mood that had accompanied Izuku throughout the day. She added that Izuku did not want to be picked up despite everything. Inko was surprised. Why didn't her son want her to call, even though he was obviously unwell? She worried that Izuku, even at just 5 years old, thought he shouldn't cause his mother any trouble, even when he was suffering. At home, Inko tried to talk to Izuku about the day, but she could hardly get anything out of him. With the information from the caregiver, she was able to piece together a rough picture of the situation, but many details remained unclear. She wondered if it would help to talk to Mitsuki, Katsuki's mother. But her hopes for a solution were slim. Inko knew from experience that Katsuki was hardly influenced by his mother. She had often noticed how stubborn and strong-willed the boy was. Nevertheless, Inko talked to Mitsuki about the incident. Mitsuki bluntly explained to her that Katsuki apparently no longer wanted to be friends with Izuku. But Inko sensed that this was only the watered-down version of the truth. Mitsuki, with her loose mouth and often rough manner, rarely let herself be seen. Her methods of education were loud and brusque, and it was easy to see where Katsuki got his spirited demeanor from. Nevertheless, Mitsuki assured Inko that she had spoken to her son and that he would be more restrained around Izuku in the future. In the following weeks, Inko watched her son closely. Izuku continued to go to preschool, despite what had happened. At least a few days after the incident, he didn't seem any worse. He began to smile a little more, even if these smiles often seemed weak and forced. Inko was not sure whether he was really over it or just trying to keep up appearances. But she respected his desire to continue going to preschool and stayed close to him to give him all the support she could. For the next 3 years, Izuku was unable to elicit any visible reaction from his quirk. He could feel the energy inside him, like a faint, constant hum, and had the feeling that he could influence its concentration in certain areas of his body. It was particularly easy for him to direct the energy into his hands, but no matter how hard he tried or how intensely he concentrated, nothing happened. Meanwhile, Izuku was attending Eldora Junior High with Katsuki and many other children from kindergarten. But Izuku hated this school. The teachers blatantly favored students with noticeable and strong quirks. On the other hand, anyone with a weak or inconspicuous quirk was at a disadvantage from the start. This unequal treatment was not a hidden system, it was actively supported by the teachers and obvious to everyone. Students with powerful quirks were downright spoiled, their mistakes were generously overlooked, they received partial credit even if their answers were flawed, and were allowed to repeat tests without any problems, often without a valid reason. The message from the teachers was clear: if you had an impressive quirk, you were allowed to make mistakes. For the others, however, like Izuku, it was quite different. A small mistake, a poorly formulated sentence, meant immediate loss of points. And the possibility of retaking tests? For students like him, it was practically non-existent. This injustice was hard for Izuku to bear. Every day, he witnessed how the system favored those who were already strong, while systematically disadvantaging the weaker ones. The teachers were clever, their favoritism was obvious enough to be frustrating, but never so clear that they could be held accountable for it. The entire school system seemed designed to further strengthen the strong, while the weak either had to adapt or perish. For Izuku, it was like running into an invisible wall, a wall that kept pushing him back no matter how hard he tried. Izuku knew that if his quirk wasn't strong enough, he would have to convince with his wits. One day, when the teacher asked a particularly difficult question and the class remained in an awkward silence, Izuku raised his hand. He explained the solution clearly and precisely, without hesitation. For a brief moment, there was absolute silence in the classroom. But instead of earning recognition or respect, he was met only with annoyed looks. Finally, snide comments broke the silence as some classmates vented their frustration. Even the teacher nodded in approval, but there was no sign of appreciation in his eyes. Izuku felt how his attempt to gain respect through knowledge backfired. Instead of admiration, he earned resentment. Nevertheless, he decided not to give up. His determination did not impress either the teachers or his classmates. It seemed that the harder he tried, the more they despised him. The fact that someone like Izuku, who they considered weak, excelled academically did not sit well with them. But Izuku's grades spoke for themselves. He outperformed most of his classmates, with only one exception, Bakugo. At first, the teachers tried to undermine Izuku's progress by deducting points for even the smallest details, often for ridiculous reasons. But then his mother got involved. Izuku was there when she went to the school board to complain. Usually the kindest person Izuku knew, his mother turned into a fierce fighter. She spoke with a determination and strength Izuku had never seen in her before. The school administration initially refused to take her complaints seriously, but when Inko threatened to involve the school board, they finally relented. It was a moving moment for Izuku. Seeing his mother fight for him gave him new courage and made him realize that he was not alone. But with the school's decision to stop sabotaging his grades, his real problems began. The teachers now left his grades alone, but Izuku became a target. The strong students, but also weaker ones who feared the wrath of the more powerful, made it a habit to bully him. At first, Bakugo stayed out of the action, but that changed abruptly when Izuku once prevented Bakugo from bullying another student. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Bakugo hissed at the time, while his explosions crackled dangerously close to Izuku's face. "If you interfere again, I'll get you." Izuku held Bakugo's gaze, even though his knees trembled with fear. But from that day on, he was the main target of Bakugo's anger and aggression. The situation at school, which had already been difficult, became a daily struggle for Izuku, which he only survived with an unwavering will. Bakugo's targeted attacks completely isolated Izuku. His refusal to intentionally perform worse, as was expected of him, drove even the few weaker students who had previously remained neutral to turn away from him. Friendships? For Izuku, this was a distant, unattainable dream. Instead, he regularly became the target of whispers and quiet laughter as he passed groups of students who followed him with mocking glances. The teachers, who were supposed to protect him, consistently ignored his suffering. Worse still, Izuku had to witness more than once how a teacher looked the other way with a satisfied smile on his face while Bakugo and his cronies harassed him. At first, Izuku tried to stand up for himself. But when Bakugo pushed him up against the wall during recess one day and came dangerously close, Izuku decided to seek help from a teacher. Hoping that his concerns would finally be heard, he explained to her what had happened. But instead of support, he only received an annoyed look. "Izuku," she began, folding her arms across her chest as she looked down at him, "you need to learn to get along better with your classmates. Maybe you're provoking them unconsciously. Have you ever thought about that?" Her words hit him like a blow. She shook her head as if he were a stubborn child and turned away without waiting for an answer. Izuku remained frozen, staring at the floor and biting his lip to hold back the tears that welled up. The message was clear: his worries and pain were not being taken seriously. Teachers always sided with the strong. They twisted reality so that the victims seemed like the guilty ones. Unlike tests, where clear evidence counted, there were no tangible traces of the bullying that Izuku could present. It was his word against theirs, a losing battle. Again and again, Izuku received negative entries in his school file, while Bakugo, the darling of the school, got off scot-free. For the headmaster, Bakugo was the figurehead of Aldera Junior High, the shining student who would be the first to attend the prestigious UA, Japan's most prestigious hero academy. Bakugo was the star, and Izuku was perceived only as a disruptive obstacle. Despite all this injustice, Izuku did not lose heart. Even when he sat alone in his room late at night, the pain gnawed deep inside him and the loneliness was overwhelming, he always found the courage to strengthen himself. Giving up is not an option. Not now, not ever, he told himself each time, with unyielding resolve. He knew he had no choice but to keep fighting, not to prove anything to anyone but for himself. A few months after Izuku's 8th birthday, his quirk first manifested itself in a visible way. In the middle of the night, a strange pain woke him from his sleep. It wasn't an ordinary headache, it felt as if something inside his skull was growing, relentlessly trying to find a way out. The throbbing pressure made him gasp for air, made him dizzy, and finally forced him to get out of bed, staggering. In the bathroom, he splashed cold water on his face, but the relief he had hoped for did not come. The pain was relentless. With shaky hands, he ran a careful hand over his head, and froze. Where the pain was the strongest, he felt 2 hard lumps. They felt warm and pulsating, as if a strange energy was surging within them. Panic seized him. What was that? Could this be normal? Or was he ill? His hands trembled as he groped for the light switch, but his fingers did not find it. When he finally looked up, he noticed that the bathroom was not completely dark. Two small, turquoise lights were weakly illuminating the room. They came from his head, exactly where the bumps were. Izuku gasped in shock and stumbled a few steps back. His reflection seemed to taunt him, the unreal glow of the lights making the whole thing even more frightening. This can't be real," he whispered desperately. "Stop, please stop glowing," he pleaded, closing his eyes and desperately trying to suppress the energy in his head, as he had already practiced on other parts of his body. But it didn't work. The pain didn't subside, the glow remained. For minutes, he battled with the relentless force in his mind, but eventually, he collapsed on the floor, exhausted. His breathing was heavy and irregular, his chest rising and falling frantically. His limbs felt heavy and weak, as if all energy had drained from his body. The pressure in his head felt like it was crushing him, while his whole body trembled with exhaustion. Izuku pulled his knees up to his chest, buried his head in them, and his hands trembled as he tried to suppress the panic. What if this never goes away, he thought desperately. What if everyone can see it? The thought made him shiver, even though the pain in his head overrode everything else. Inko woke up during the night to the sounds coming from the bathroom. At first, she assumed that Izuku just had to go to the bathroom and would go right back to bed. But as the minutes passed and she heard neither footsteps nor the familiar sound of the closing door, a feeling of unease crept up in her. Worried, she swung the blanket aside and got up to check on her son. No sooner had she left the bedroom than she heard a soft sob coming from the bathroom. An overwhelming protective instinct took hold of her, and she felt her hands begin to tremble slightly. 1,000 questions shot through her mind. Why is Izuku crying in the middle of the night? What happened? Despite her growing concern, she forced herself to remain calm. The hallway was in complete darkness, only a faint turquoise glow seeped through the ajar bathroom door. Inko paused, leaned against the doorframe and gently knocked against it without looking into the room. "Izuku, my darling, is everything all right?" The sobbing stopped for a moment. Good, he heard me, she thought with relief. But when the silence continued and there was no answer, she tried again, her voice gentle and reassuring. "What happened? Can I come in?" After a few seconds, Izuku's trembling voice was heard, interrupted by soft sobs. "My Quirk. It hurts." These words were enough to make Inko act. With a queasy feeling, she opened the door and froze when she saw her son. Izuku was kneeling on the floor, powerless, his small body looked hunched over. His shoulders hung limply, and his eyes were red and swollen from tears. He looked up at his mother with a look of deep despair on his face, while his trembling lips tried to say something. Two large, glowing lumps on the sides of his head cast a faint turquoise glow on the bathroom walls. Inko immediately lowered herself to him, wrapped her arms around him and gently pulled him into a firm embrace. "Don't worry, Izuku, everything will be fine," she whispered, stroking his back reassuringly. "Does it hurt a lot?" Izuku snuggled up to her, seeking comfort in her closeness, while tears still ran down his cheeks. "A little, it's getting less," he finally answered quietly. Inko held him close, felt his little body tremble, and spoke in a gentle voice. "Do you think you can hold out for a few more hours, my darling? I'll call the doctor right away, and I'm sure we can get an appointment quickly." Izuku nodded weakly before asking, confused, "What about school?" Inko smiled to herself, her son was so dutiful, even in a situation like this. But at the same time, her concern grew. What if he was seriously ill? Gently, she put a hand on his shoulder. "You're not going to school today, Izuku. I'll call them later and sort it out." Izuku took a deep breath, and a hint of relief crossed his face. "Can you go back to sleep, or would you like to have tea with me and watch a little TV until the sun comes up?" Inko asked with a loving smile. "That sounds great," Izuku replied quietly, wiping away the last of his tears with his hand. A warm wave of relief washed over him, and the tension that had been weighing on him like a heavy stone began to lift. As they walked together towards the living room, he suddenly asked, still with a small sob in his voice, "Can I have a cap?" Inko paused and looked at him in surprise, confused for a moment. "A cap? Why do you want a cap? You don't have to hide from me." Izuku hesitated, searching for the right words. His thoughts felt jumbled, and he didn't fully understand why he felt this urge himself. It's not because of that. I don't know exactly, he finally stammered, unable to explain the feeling. Inko nodded sympathetically. It's all right, my darling. I'll get you a cap. She lovingly covered Izuku on the sofa with a blanket and handed him the remote control. Choose something, I'll bring you your tea in a moment. In the kitchen, she put on water for the tea and then began looking for a suitable cap in an old drawer in the hallway. The selection was meager, neither she nor Izuku had been big cap wearers so far. Izuku did have some All Might fan caps, but they were bound to be too tight and would only press on the painful bumps. Finally, in the far corner of the drawer, she came across an old fishing hat belonging to her ex-husband. That should do for a start, she murmured to herself, dusting the hat off. A soft click from the kettle reminded her to make the tea. She added a small spoonful of honey to sweeten it a little before taking it to the living room. Here you go, darling, she said gently as she placed the tea on the table in front of Izuku. Then she held up the hat to him. What do you think, will this do for now? Izuku nodded, and Inko gently placed the hat on his head. As soon as she put it on, Izuku visibly relaxed. The tension left his face and he seemed much more relaxed. He really seems to be feeling better, Inko thought with relief. Her gaze wandered to the TV to see which program Izuku had chosen. She smiled when she recognized a repeat of an interview with All Might. Izuku had this extraordinary talent of finding the only program in which All Might appeared, even in the middle of the night. When she looked at her son again, she noticed that he had already fallen asleep. He must be completely exhausted, she thought gently, especially if he falls asleep during a program with All Might. But he probably already knows this interview inside out. Inko rearranged the blanket and sat with him for a moment before getting up quietly to let him sleep in peace. As expected, they got an appointment with their usual quack doctor that same morning. After a thorough examination, the doctor quickly came to the conclusion that the bumps on Izuku's head were not dangerous. An X-ray showed that no bone tissue had formed under the bumps. Instead, the doctor suspected that they were filled with Izuku's energy, which also explained the glowing shimmer. As a precaution, he refrained from taking a direct sample. Since the bumps had formed symmetrically and simultaneously, the doctor ruled out an uncontrolled outbreak of madness. He was also unable to detect any other accumulations of energy. To relieve the pain, he prescribed mild painkillers. He assumed that the energy would penetrate the scalp in the next few days. For Izuku, the visit to the doctor went without a hitch at first. He even seemed to be in relatively good spirits, at least until the doctor asked him to take off his hat to examine the bumps more closely. His mood changed abruptly. It took a lot of coaxing from his mother before he reluctantly agreed and took off his hat. Inko was puzzled by her son's sudden change of mood. Later, she asked the doctor for his opinion and also mentioned Izuku's behavior that morning. The doctor explained that it could possibly be a kind of instinctive behavior. With mutation quirks, it was not uncommon for them to be accompanied by uncharacteristic instincts. If she was seriously concerned, he recommended seeing a quirk psychologist. But Inko decided not to pursue this suggestion for the time being. The urge to wear a hat did not seem worrying to her. After all, she had colleagues with mutation quirks at work, and many of them also displayed unusual behavior or habits. For the moment, Inko decided to keep Izuku at home until the situation with his quirk had stabilized. She wasn't too worried about him missing anything at school. Her son was way ahead of the other kids in his class anyway. To her regret, Izuku hadn't made any new friends in recent years, spending a lot of time studying instead. In addition to his schoolwork, he devoured every piece of information about heroes he could get, and had been collecting them in his notebooks for years. What had initially started out as childish scribbles had now become amazingly precise analyses, particularly impressive for an 8-year-old. In the days that followed, what the doctor had predicted came true. The energy in Izuku's head continued to spread. One afternoon, while he was sitting at his desk, eagerly taking notes in one of his hero notebooks, a strong tingling sensation suddenly shot through him. It started gently, but quickly became more intense, turning into a throbbing pain that took his breath away. With a startled "ouch, what is that?" Izuku dropped the pen and grabbed his head. His face contorted in pain, as if an invisible force was raging inside his skull. The sensation grew, like an unstoppable wave racing through his head and displacing every clear thought. Suddenly, a scream escaped him as the pain reached its peak. In his panic, he hastily leaned back, causing his chair to tip over and him to land roughly on the floor. While he was still trying to orient himself, a bright turquoise light flooded the room, so bright that it bathed the walls and furniture in an unreal glow. Then it happened. A sharp, almost unbearable pain shot through his head, only to disappear abruptly the next moment, as if someone had flipped a switch. Panting, Izuku lay on the floor, his heart pounding in his chest, while he tried to grasp the sudden calm. But something was different. A soft, turquoise light filled the room, casting flickering patterns on the walls and seemingly permeating the air with a strange energy. Izuku slowly raised a trembling hand to rub his head, but then he noticed something strange. A glowing flicker, floating at the edge of his field of vision, caught his attention. What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. He carefully sat up, his movements hesitant, as if he was afraid of driving away the light. But when his gaze fell on the window, he was speechless. An incredible sight was reflected in the glass. Above his head floated two glowing forms that looked like wings, woven from pulsating turquoise light. Their elegant, curved contours radiated a mixture of strength and beauty, interspersed with spiral patterns that pulsated with a rhythmic glow. They felt strangely familiar, as if they had always been a part of him, just waiting to be released. While Izuku was still looking at the wings in amazement, he heard quick, hurried footsteps in the hallway. A few seconds later, his mother stormed into the room, alarmed by his scream and the loud crash of the overturned chair. "Izuku! Are you all right? What happened?" Her voice trembled with concern as her gaze swept the room, and then she froze. Her eyes widened when she saw the glowing wings floating out from her son. Izuku turned to her, his green eyes shining with excitement and a small, proud smile on his lips. The pain was forgotten, replaced by a wave of wonder and an unexpected joy. "Mom, look, my quirk," he exclaimed, his voice full of enthusiasm. Inko stood rooted to the spot for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight. Then she broke out of her stupor and slowly approached. Her initial concern faded, replaced by relief and a touch of pride. She carefully crossed the room and gently embraced her son, without taking her eyes off the fascinating wings. "Izuku, they're beautiful," she whispered, her voice warm with affection as she stroked his back reassuringly. "Do you really think so?" Izuku asked, his eyes glowing with excitement. "They feel strong. And they look like real wings, don't they?" He broke away from his mother's embrace and turned to the window again to look at the wings in his reflection. A broad grin spread across his face. "I think I like them, Mom." Inko smiled and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Her gaze also wandered to the shimmering wings glowing in the turquoise light. Izuku looked at them thoughtfully for a moment before turning back to his mother. "Mom, I need a hat, one that covers the wings. The old fishing hat is definitely not suitable anymore." Inko frowned, then nodded with an understanding smile. "That's a good idea, Izuku. I'll sew you a hat. Do you already have an idea of what it should look like?" Izuku thought for a moment and then said with a small smile, "Maybe a simple hat, but with something like ears on it, so that the wings have enough space?" Inko laughed softly, her smile warm and full of love. "I can do that. I'll get my fabric and make the best hat, something that suits you perfectly, my little hero." Izuku's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "That would be great, Mama. Thank you so much." His joy was infectious, and Inko felt her heart overflow with pride and affection. She stroked his hair gently once more and said with a soft smile, "Anything for my little hero." Sewing the hat turned out to be much more difficult than Inko had expected. The first attempt seemed successful at first, and Izuku was overjoyed to put on the new hat. But the very next day, it became apparent that the construction was not holding up. The ears of the cap began to disintegrate. It was clear that the fabric Inko usually used was no match for the intense energy Izuku's wings radiated. Fortunately, she had decided to keep her son at home for the rest of the week, giving her more time to find a solution. The next day, Izuku and his mother went to the Quirk doctor again, since they needed to update Izuku's Quirk log anyway. But ᴡᴇ'ʟ was unsure how to broach the issue of the hat disintegrating. The visit proved more difficult than expected. Now that the wings had fully unfolded, Izuku adamantly refused to show them to the doctor. He couldn't explain exactly why this thought repulsed him so much. It was as if the wings were a deeply personal part of him, not meant for others to see. This feeling of revealing something so intimate and foreign made it impossible for him to show them. It wasn't fear that held him back, but an instinctive, deeply rooted need to protect this part of himself. Every time the doctor or his mother urged him, he just pulled his hat down over his head more tightly, as if it were the last barrier keeping him and his wings from the outside world. "Come on, sweetheart, the doctor needs to look at your wings," ᴡᴇ'ʟ said gently, trying to calm her son. But Izuku just shook his head and held the hat that his mother had sewn for him firmly on his head, as if it could shield him from the world. "I don't want to," he murmured softly, almost defiantly, while he lowered his gaze to the ground. ᴡᴇ'ʟ sighed heavily and turned to the doctor apologetically. "I'm really sorry, doctor." Izuku was not usually so unruly. "He's just been through so much lately, and I'm very worried about him." Her voice sounded soft, but her face reflected the exhaustion that had accumulated over the last few days. "It's all right, Ms. Midoriya, it's just another aspect of his quirk that I'll note," the doctor said in a placating tone, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. He began to explain, thoughtfully stroking his beard, "Regarding the problem with the headgear, I might have a solution. There are special fabrics that are made from the hair or blood of the person affected. These fabrics adapt to the quirks and are particularly robust." ᴡᴇ'ʟ frowned and replied in surprise, "I've never heard of that." The doctor nodded slightly and continued, "I'm not surprised. Such materials are usually only used by heroes, as they are extremely expensive to produce. But there is a way to apply for government assistance in special cases." When ᴡᴇ'ʟ learned that these special fabrics were used primarily by heroes, she turned pale. The thought of how expensive such materials must be made her throat tight. Hero equipment and related services were known to be exorbitantly expensive, far beyond what she could ever afford. The mere idea of having to bear the costs made her hands tremble. "How am I going to pay for this?" she wondered to herself, as a wave of worry washed over her. Finally, she gathered herself and asked in a firm but concerned voice, "What do we have to do to get government assistance?" The doctor stroked his beard again and nodded slowly. "You showed me the damaged hat, and I was able to measure residues of the energy," he explained matter-of-factly. The measurements on Izuku's head also indicate that no ordinary fabric can withstand it in the long term, at least not if it is to remain flexible. "Of course, it would be easier if I could measure the wings directly, without Izuku wearing the hat," the doctor remarked with a slightly tense smile. "But with the available data and my report, you can still submit the application. You can find the appropriate form online." ᴡᴇ'ʟ noticed the slight frustration in his expression and sensed that the doctor would have liked more detailed examinations or even samples. "How long will it take for the application to be processed?" she finally asked. Her voice sounded uncertain but determined. The doctor took a deep breath, visibly trying to remain patient. "If the application is rejected, you will know within a few days. If it is approved, the entire procedure will take a few weeks. First, you will send blood and hair samples, which we will do here at the clinic. After that, you will receive an appointment with a specialized tailor in your area. I recommend bringing a sketch of the hat you want. The tailor will then take all the relevant measurements, and it will take another week or two for the hat to be completed." During the conversation, Izuku sat silently in his chair. He felt oppressed. He was uncomfortable about causing his mother trouble again, but the thought of showing his wings was unbearable for him. Even in front of his own mother, he found it difficult to reveal this part of himself. When ᴡᴇ'ʟ finally stood up, bowed slightly to the doctor and thanked him for his time and help, Izuku started. Hastily, he jumped up as well, imitating her bow and holding his hat tightly with one hand. It was as if the hat represented an invisible barrier that protected him, not only from prying eyes, but also from his own insecurity. Holding it gave him a sense of control in a situation that was increasingly beyond his control. It took 3 months before Izuku finally held the long-awaited hat in his hands. Although the government assistance was quickly granted, the company that produced the fabric from Izuku's DNA took longer than originally announced. There were apparently problems with production, and Izuku even had to provide blood and hair samples a second time. These months were a time full of contradictions for Izuku. On the one hand, the best he had experienced in years, but on the other hand, extremely nerve-wracking. He enjoyed not having to go to school. He was able to study undisturbed at home, without bullying during breaks, without Katsuki pressing him against the wall, and without the disparaging looks of the teachers. But at the same time, he felt severely restricted in his freedom. He could hardly leave the house because none of the caps his mother sewed lasted more than a day before they began to disintegrate. For this reason, he only wore them when absolutely necessary. However, his mother didn't want him to barricade himself completely in his room, and occasionally urged him to go outside. These trips were always uncomfortable for Izuku, as he constantly feared that his hat might suddenly vanish into thin air. His biggest worry, however, was running into Katsuki and his friends. The idea that Katsuki might rip the hat off his head just to annoy him was a nightmare for Izuku. Fortunately, this never happened, even though there were two dicey situations in which he was able to hide in time before he was discovered. When the tailor finally called to say that the hat was ready, and his mother told him about it, Izuku was initially not very enthusiastic. He immediately realized that this meant he would have to return to school soon. His mother had emphasized from the start that studying from home permanently was out of the question. Although there were online school classes he could take, she didn't want him to isolate himself completely. But when Izuku put on the new hat for the first time at the tailor's, he was surprised by what he felt. He suddenly realized how much energy he had previously lost without noticing. It felt as if he had been standing in the freezing cold before, only in thin clothes, and would now suddenly be wrapped in a warm snowsuit with a hood and thick boots. In that moment, Izuku decided never to take the hat off again. The hat itself was unique. It completely enclosed his head in delicate wings without constricting them. The material was soft but incredibly sturdy, designed to isolate the energy of his wings. The ears on the sides were flexible and offered enough space for Izuku's wings. Their position changed depending on Izuku's state of mind. In relaxed moments they lay flat, but when he was excited or happy, they straightened slightly. The dark turquoise surface of the hat harmonized perfectly with the shimmering light of his wings, while white accents at the tips of the ears provided a subtle contrast. This hat was more than just a head covering, it was a liberation. For the first time in a long time, Izuku felt safe. The headgear allowed him to move around freely without drawing attention to his wings and provided him with the protection he needed in his daily life. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, not a single cloud was to be seen. Izuku was walking along his old way to school again after a long time. "Why do I have to go back to this school of all places?" the green-haired boy muttered and sighed heavily. "I can study much better at home. There I don't have to worry about teachers or classmates who try to spoil every success for me." His steps slowed as he continued to talk to himself. Izuku was still a little angry with his mother. He understood that she didn't want him to be alone all the time, but she didn't realize that he felt just as alone at Eldora High. People who ignored or bullied you were no cure for loneliness. "I just don't know how to explain this to her without her worrying," he thought with a gloomy look. Another worry tormented him. What if Kacchan or the others tore the new hat off his head? His mother had explicitly told the school administration that wearing the hat was necessary because of its quirk. Izuku knew that the teachers wouldn't dare to force him to take off his hat, not if they wanted to prevent his mother from interfering. She wouldn't accept any attempt to discriminate against her son, and the public would also have little sympathy for a teacher discriminating against a student because of his quirk. For the students, however, the situation was different. They would be forgiven for misbehaving, after all, they were still young. Izuku did not expect much help from the teachers in this matter. He made a firm decision: if someone tried to rip his hat off his head, he would fight back. But it wasn't long before his resolve was put to the test. Kacchan and his friends were already waiting for him at the school gate. Mitsuki, Kacchan's mother, had probably told her son that Izuku would be going back to school that day. Izuku actually liked Mitsuki. Despite her loose tongue, she had always been kind to him, and he was happy when she came to visit. But the fact that she had passed on such information was of no help to him at this moment. "Well, who's back again? I had hoped you had finally realized how useless you were and given up school," sneered Bakugo, arms folded and chin arrogantly raised. His friends in the background grinned spitefully, their eyes fixed on Izuku. Izuku took a deep breath, summoned the courage he had mustered on the way over here, and replied firmly, "I didn't give up. I couldn't come to school for a while, but I continued my studies at home." Bakugo laughed briefly, an artificial, mocking laugh. "My mother told me that your quirk has finally manifested," he said, mocking. "But of course it's manifesting itself in the most useless way possible." Izuku felt the words stick in his throat. He wanted to defend his quirk, but the truth was that he couldn't think of anything that made his energy wings useful. Maybe they could dimly illuminate a room, but even that seemed insignificant. And there was no way he would take off his hat to show them. A malicious smile spread across Kacchan's face, growing wider with every second that Izuku failed to respond. "You see, useless. Not even you can think of anything to do with your quirk," he sneered. Then he turned his head halfway over his shoulder to his friends. "And it's probably also but ugly. Why else would he hide it under a hat?" Slowly, Kacchan turned his gaze back to Izuku, his smile disappeared, and his voice became threatening. "Then let's find out what he's hiding under his hat." Kacchan had never sounded so threatening before. He had often been angry or furious, but this tone of voice was different. Instinctively, Izuku backed away, only to bump into Kacchan's friends after a few steps. He had been concentrating so hard on Kacchan that he hadn't even noticed them positioning themselves behind him. With a smug grin, they hooked their arms under his and pulled him roughly away from the entrance gate. They knew that the teachers would hardly do anything, but no random passerby was allowed to see what they were planning. Izuku desperately tried to free himself from their grip, but even without Kacchan's help, they were too strong for him. When they were out of sight, Kacchan stepped forward and began to pull on Izuku's hat with both hands. Izuku wanted to press his own hands on the hat to protect it, but the boys were holding on too tightly. He could feel the fabric barely giving way despite Kacchan's efforts. "Damn it! Why can't I get this thing off?" Kacchan hissed in frustration. His eyes sparkled with annoyance. "Deku, did you glue that hat on?" Izuku blinked in confusion. Of course he hadn't glued the hat on. But then he felt it. The energy of his wings seemed to have attached itself to the fabric like invisible threads, preventing Kacchan from taking it off. The next moment, Kacchan grabbed the cloth ears of Izuku's hat and pulled with all his might. A sharp pain shot through Izuku, but before he could react, the unexpected happened. Kacchan was hurled several meters backward with force. For a moment, there was complete silence. Izuku blinked in confusion before realizing what had happened. He had instinctively let himself fall back and then pushed Kacchan away from him with a powerful kick to the stomach. Kacchan's friends stared at him in disbelief. They had never seen anything like this before. Izuku had never fought back before. Unsure of what to do next, they loosened their grip on his arms. But the moment did not last long. Katsuki straightened up again, his eyes glowing with rage. Without a word, his friends realized that it was getting serious now, and they tightened their grip, pulling Izuku up again. "How dare you kick me?" Katsuki hissed, taking threatening steps towards him. His voice was full of anger, and his gaze seemed to want to pierce Izuku. "I'll show you your place in the world." Izuku tried to remain calm, but he felt his heart pounding against his ribs. I didn't," he began hesitantly, but Katsuki interrupted him. "Now you're not only useless, but also a villain." "I'm not a villain," Izuku protested, his voice trembling but firm. Katsuki laughed coldly and shook his head. "Oh yes, you are. I am the future #1 hero. And anyone who attacks a hero is a villain. It is a hero's duty to punish villains." His voice was loud and full of conviction, as if he wanted to convince the world around him that he was in the right. From that day on, Izuku decided to stop using Katsuki's nickname, Kacchan. Instead, he called him only Bakugo, a clear distancing of the friendship they once shared. But even though Bakugo no longer held back, he never tried to knock Izuku's hat off again. "Bakugo has gone too far, advising me to make a leap of faith to get a useful quirk in my next life." Bakugo smirked arrogantly, his arms folded as if he owned the world. His sparkling eyes radiated with mockery, and his tone dripped with arrogance. He revels in his superiority and takes pleasure in keeping others beneath him. Izuku was boiling with rage. Bakugo has always humiliated him in every conceivable way, and the intensity of his cruelty has only increased over the years. It's the first day of their final year of middle school, and Bakugo wastes no time in demonstrating his dominance. Izuku can hardly believe that there was a time when they were almost inseparable. That was before Bakugo's quirk appeared and changed everything. Now, every encounter with him is a fight. He turns every conversation into a power play, a spectacle that belittles Izuku in front of others. Even worse, the class and even the teachers willingly support Bakugo. Just this morning, the whole class laughed uproariously when the teacher mentioned that Izuku was also planning to take the entrance exam for UA. At the age of 14, Izuku feels as if he will never escape the shadow of humiliation. He has made progress and can now concentrate the energy of his quirk to the point where his palms glow. But that's no more than a faint turquoise light, barely enough to illuminate a dark room. My quirk is hardly more useful than a glorified flashlight, he thinks dejectedly. The ears of his hat, which hides his sensitive wings, fall resignedly on his head. They immediately betray his mood, a peculiarity that sometimes drives Izuku to despair. It is almost impossible for him to hide his feelings, something that makes him particularly uncomfortable in situations like these. Even with great effort, he can only control the movement of his ears for a short time, a constant battle against himself. Izuku runs across the schoolyard, his eyes tirelessly scanning the surroundings. His notebook is gone, along with all his thoughts, dreams, and plans. His feelings rage like a storm inside him, anger, frustration, and a quiet, stubborn hope that he will find the book after all. How can Bakugo get away with this again and again, he wonders as his gaze systematically searches every corner. This notebook is so important, all my observations about heroes and villains, everything is in there. The thought that Bakugo just threw it away as if it were worthless makes Izuku's hands tremble. How can someone be so reckless? With every step, his resolve sinks, a quiet, cynical voice in his head whispers to him that it's hopeless. No, Izuku thinks with grim determination, I will find it. And one day I will be strong enough that no one will be able to tear my dreams apart so easily. It was shortly after school let out when the chaos began. While packing up his things, Bakugo simply grabbed the book, singed it with his compass, and then threw it out the window. Of course, he laughed out loud as he did so, supported by his friends, who exchanged mocking comments about Izuku. The line about the swallow's leap is the height of their malice. Izuku took it all in his stride, bowing his head so as not to attract any further attention. But now, alone in the schoolyard, his anger continues to simmer. What would Bakugo's mother do if she had heard that, he thinks. The idea brings a slight, bitter smile to his lips. She would probably have slapped him in the face and shouted at him. But that would hardly have bothered Bakugo, not with his attitude. And his own mother? Izuku can hardly imagine seeing her really angry. She is always so gentle and calm and so concerned about him. But that's exactly what makes it difficult for him to tell her about his suffering. In recent years, he has kept the bullying to himself for the most part. She knows that he has no friends and sometimes comes home with torn clothes or minor injuries, but Izuku doesn't want to burden her anymore. He wants to spare her grief and is therefore trying to get through it on his own. Just one more year, Izuku thinks to himself, as he keeps scanning the surroundings. Just one more year, and I'll never have to go back to that damn school again. The thought gives him a touch of comfort. If he passes the UA entrance exam, Bakugo will still be there, but it won't be the same. The UA is different. It is taught by professional heroes, people who have earned their position through hard work and impressive abilities. They impress with their strength, wisdom, and dedication. And the students? They are not your average classmates. They are aspiring heroes who share the same dream of protecting people and making the world a better place. The thought of this fills Izuku with a mixture of excitement and hope. UA is known for its strict anti-bullying policy. No one, not even Bakugo, would be able to get away with such behavior there. UA is also the alma mater of All Might, the symbol of peace. If Izuku makes it there, he will not only feel a little closer to his idol, he will finally be in an environment that allows him to reach his full potential. This prospect gives him new strength and makes him speed up his pace. However, if he doesn't make it to UA, he'll get rid of Bakugo for good. Izuku has no illusions. Bakugo will surely pass the entrance exam. His grades are excellent, and unfortunately well-deserved, as Izuku reluctantly has to admit. His flawless school record, on the other hand, is not his merit, but the result of a school that has swept dozens, if not hundreds, of Bakugo's offenses under the rug. Finally, Izuku finds his notebook floating in the pond, with the koi nibbling away at it. "This isn't food, you stupid fish," he mutters, and carefully fishes the notebook out of the water. "If I dry it in the sun, I might be able to save it. Or at least transfer the contents to a new notebook later." After the notebook has dried halfway, Izuku sets off for home. He wants to continue practicing. The fact that he has managed to make his hands glow motivates him. Somewhere deep inside, he senses that his energy can do more than just replace a flashlight. He just doesn't know how to unlock that potential yet. On his way home, Izuku passes through a busy shopping street. The voices of the merchants and passers-by merge into a lively soundscape, interspersed with the scent of freshly baked taiyaki and grilled yakitori. The afternoon sun warms his face as its rays reflect off the shop windows. The muffled scraping of shoes and the occasional squeak of stroller wheels on the pavement create a soothing backdrop. Here, in this very place, a villain attack took place this morning. The villain was huge, but Kamui Woods and Entei Lady easily overcame him. Izumo's thoughts drift away. With the appearance of the quirks over 100 years ago, many people abused their powers to oppress or exploit others. The governments and law enforcement of the time were overwhelmed by the new reality. In the midst of the chaos, brave citizens decided to take the protection of the general public into their own hands, and the first heroes were born. But this era was characterized by instability. Wars, famines, and powerful supervillains brought countless countries to their knees. Some regions remain lawless areas to this day. Izuku often wonders how people could find hope when the world was so broken. Perhaps it was precisely these first heroes who brought light into the darkness, people who used their quirks not for themselves but for others. The thought fills him with awe and a slight doubt. Will I ever be that strong? Can I do that too? Only the wealthy and powerful countries have survived the turmoil in any way. Smaller and poorer countries had hardly a chance, especially when climate change hit with full force. Since the first quirks appeared, the world population has almost halved. Japan is now considered one of the safest countries in the world, a feat attributed above all to All Might. But even with one of the lowest crime rates in the world, Japan still needs many heroes. Rising temperatures are leading to more frequent natural disasters such as storms, floods, and heat waves, which affect the population, put countless people in danger and cause immense costs for reconstruction. Resources for progress or innovation are scarce, and the economy has been stagnating for decades. For most people, this is the normal state of affairs. These topics are rarely discussed at school, but Izuku knows an astonishing amount about them. He spends hours scouring the internet, absorbing every piece of information and storing it in his memory. For him, knowledge is not just a distraction, it is his tool, his hope of surviving in a world full of challenges. After Izuku has finished his inner monologue, he continues on his way home. The streets are getting quieter, and the bustling crowds are gradually fading behind him. But as he walks through an underpass, the cloth ears of his hat straighten up. An inexplicable feeling of threat overcomes him, more intense than anything he has ever felt. His senses are on high alert, and then he hears a slimy, unpleasant sound behind him. Izuku whirls around and just barely sees a green, slimy mass shooting towards him in a high arc. He reflexively throws up his hands, closes his eyes and braces himself for the impact. But instead, he hears a choking rattle behind him. Hesitantly, Izuku opens his eyes. The slimy mass that almost caught him has disappeared. With his heart pounding, he slowly turns around and sees a repulsive pile of mucus forming piece by piece. "What were you doing, boy?" the green mass growls, while a grotesque mouth and two eerie eyes emerge on its misshapen body. Izuku stares at the creature, unable to move. His lips instinctively form the words that are circling in his head, "A villain." The villain laughs mockingly, an almost cheerful yet simultaneously derogatory voice. "You're one of the very clever ones," he scoffs. "I don't know how you escaped me, but you won't succeed again." The slimy figure suddenly shoots into the air, ready to pounce on Izuku again. But it splats on the ground a few meters away from him. Izuku's mind begins to race. The villain seems not only confused but weakened as well. The choking and gagging from before suggests that something is wrong. His entire body is made of slime, but his eyes seem firm. Maybe that's his weak point, Izuku thinks. An angry growl pulls Izuku back to the present. The villain trembles with rage as he rears up again. "What did you do to me, brat?" His voice is now deep and menacing, filled with pure rage. There is no trace of the rattling and choking to be heard, instead he seems more determined and dangerous than before. Izuku instinctively steps back, his eyes darting hectically from side to side, looking for a way out. But the underpass is long, and the exits are far away. He feels the confinement of the tunnel like a prison, while he slowly retreats towards the entrance he came through. Just as the villain prepares to launch his next attack, a loud crashing sound breaks the tense silence. A manhole cover shoots up towards the tunnel ceiling with incredible force. The thunderous words that follow make both Izuku and the villain stop in their tracks. "It's all right now, my boy, because I'm here." The words echo through the tunnel, and then All Might steps into the light. Dressed in a simple white t-shirt and olive green 3/4 length trousers, he appears almost ordinary if it were not for his powerful charisma. His upright posture, confident grin and aura of unwavering strength seem to fill the room with confidence. Izuku whirls around, his heart racing. In the shadow of the tunnel stands the tall figure, surrounded by an almost tangible sense of security. It's All Might. His idol, his dream, just a few feet away. At that moment, all thoughts of the villain fade. Izuku's heart beats wildly with excitement as he sees his all-time favorite hero, radiant and fearless as ever. Hope and admiration overwhelm him. For a moment, the world actually feels safe. All Might acts with lightning speed. In a fraction of a second, he halves the distance to the villain. The slime villain tries in panic to hurl a part of his body at him, but All Might effortlessly dodges it. His thunderous voice echoes through the tunnel again, "Texas Smosh." The blow is so powerful that the wind blast tears the slime villain apart into countless small lumps. The strong gust brings tears to Izuku's eyes, and he reflexively squeezes them shut. When he opens them again, he sees All Might sealing the cap of an XXL soft drink bottle. Izuku blinks and stares at the scene in disbelief. On closer inspection, he recognizes the used villain in the bottle, or what's left of him. Stunned, he wonders how All Might was able to capture the villain so quickly. Even more confusing is the thought of how it even fits in the bottle. "Are you all right, young man?" All Might's warm, friendly voice pulls Izuku out of his thoughts. The hero looks at him with concern before continuing. "I'm sorry you got caught up in my villain pursuit. I'm usually not the type to get into these kinds of situations. I guess I was a little overconfident, since it was my day off and I'm not that familiar with this neighborhood yet." He laughs loudly and heartily, his sound echoing through the tunnel. "But thanks to you, my boy, I was able to capture him safely." All Might lifts 2 bottles into the air as he speaks and presents Izuku with the captured villain with a proud smile. Izuku can't take his eyes off All Might. He stands frozen, unable to move, as his heart pounds wildly. A wave of awe and overwhelming joy washes over him as he sees the radiant hero before him. His legs feel like jelly, and for a moment, the world around him seems to stand still. The tunnel, the villain, even his own name fade away. The #1 hero of all. All Might. The real All Might. His mind races, and his heart pounds as he takes in the scene. But then a sudden thought hits him. This is the perfect opportunity to get his autograph. Hastily, Izuku scans the tunnel, looking for his notebook, which must have fallen out of his hands during the attack. He spots it a few meters away, runs over, and hastily flips it open. As he turns to look at All Might again, he suddenly stops dead in his tracks. His breath catches in his throat as he stares at the page of his notebook. Right across the middle is the name All Might written in large, curving letters. Amazed, he whispers, "Oh wow, he's already signed it." But, when did he do that? With trembling hands, Izuku turns around as quickly as possible and bows repeatedly to the hero. "Thank you so much. I'll treasure it like a family heirloom." His voice trembles with excitement, while his eyes shine with awe. All Might gives him a thumbs up and grins widely. "Okay, I'll take this guy to the police station now," he says, tapping one of the 2 bottles in his pocket. He is just getting ready to fly away with a mighty leap when Izuku suddenly senses his chance. "Please wait a moment, All Might. I need your advice." Izuku's voice trembles slightly, a mixture of fear and nervousness, even though he tries to sound confident. All Might pauses and turns to him, his forehead slightly wrinkled. After a moment's consideration, he says, "I'm in a hurry, but thanks to you, I was able to capture the villain without any problems. I can give you a few minutes, but then I have to go." Izuku blinks in surprise. Although he asked, he didn't really expect the great All Might to stop and listen to him. Hastily, he collects his thoughts, gathers all his courage and manages to speak with a clear voice this time. "I want to become a hero. That has always been my dream, to be a hero like you. I plan to apply to UA next year," but his words falter and he swallows hard. "My quirk is useless," he finally manages to say. His voice is quiet and he takes a step back, his hands nervously grasping the fabric ears of his hat. Sweat collects in the palms of his hands, and for a moment he dare not look All Might directly in the eye. But then he raises his head and his eyes hopefully seek out those of the hero. Taking a deep breath, he adds, "Can I still become a hero?" All Might looks at him silently for a moment, his eyes seem pensive. Finally, he says, "Oh, I thought you had used your quirk against the villain to keep him in check." "I didn't say anything because I didn't want to get you in trouble. The authorities are very strict when it comes to the use of quirks by civilians. Such uses are strictly regulated." He glances over his shoulder as if he has lost track of time, and then continues a little more hastily. "Maybe you used it unconsciously. That wouldn't be unusual, quirks often only show their potential in stressful situations. But I wish I had more time to explain this to you. The clock is ticking, my boy." Izuku frowns, his thoughts racing. The villain's reaction had been really strange, but everything happened so fast. Did he use his quirk unconsciously? "I'm not sure," he finally admits. "At least I didn't use it consciously," but the villain seemed confused. All Might nods slowly, pausing for a moment as if about to add something. His eyes narrow slightly, and he seems to be searching for the right words. But then he shakes his head and straightens up, his familiar, confident grin on his lips. "You should keep an eye on your quirk. Maybe it's not as useless as you think." These words fill Izuku with a warmth he hasn't felt in a long time. It's as if they've erased the countless times Bakugo called him useless. But then All Might's tone becomes serious. "Your quirk aside, you can't become a hero the way you are now." He takes a small step back, runs his hand thoughtfully through his hair and seems a little unsure about the next sentence. "I'm not saying this to discourage you. But you're hardly more than skin and bones. You need muscles, and I bet your stamina also leaves something to be desired. In this state, you would never pass the entrance exam." Izuku slowly raises his eyes. Pain is reflected in his eyes, mixed with the fear that his dream may be out of reach. But then he sees All Might's broad grin, which breaks through the darkness like a ray of light. "But you can work on these things," the hero adds with conviction. With incredible speed, All Might grabs Izuku's notebook and starts writing. His hand flies so fast over the page that it looks like he is writing a whole novel. Finally, he hands the notebook back to Izuku and explains, "I've written you a training plan. If you stick to it, you have a real chance of passing the UA entrance exam." Izuku hesitantly takes the notebook, his fingers tremble slightly. But there is no fear in his eyes anymore, only determination. A new flame burns in him. "Well, I really have to go now." All Might straightens up, tenses his mighty legs and smiles down at Izuku one more time. Before the boy can react, the hero leaps into the sky with a mighty bound and disappears into the distance. Beginning of April. Izuku stares after All Might for a while, speechless, holding the notebook tightly in his trembling hands. His heart is beating wildly with excitement, while an awestruck smile spreads across his face. In this moment, the world seems to stand still. He imagines what it would be like to be a great hero like his idol one day. He walks home in a trance, barely able to perceive his surroundings. It is only when he arrives home and collapses exhausted on the couch that he realizes what he has in his hands. It is a guide to his dream of becoming a hero, written by the greatest of all heroes and his absolute idol. His gaze wanders around the living room, over the familiar details that so often comfort him. The slightly worn couch with the cushions that are a bit too soft, the small coffee table, marked by the rings of old coffee cups, and the family photos on the dresser show only him and his mother. Not a single picture shows his father. After his parents' divorce, Izuku still had occasional contact with his father at first, but this gradually diminished. Phone calls became less frequent until they finally stopped altogether. Izuku tried to maintain the connection for a long time, but when he realized that the interest was one-sided, he eventually stopped. He lets out a small sigh when he realizes that his mother is not home yet. A quick glance at the clock tells him that it won't be long before she returns from work. With a pounding heart, Izuku opens the notebook and studies the training plan. His eyes widen and his gaze freezes. "This will kill me," he mutters in disbelief. His hands begin to tremble slightly and a cold sweat forms on his forehead. For a moment, he feels like he can't breathe, but he forces himself to take a deep breath to process the initial shock. The plan is titled the American Dream Plan and is nothing less than a nightmare of training sessions, running several kilometers a day, lifting weights, endurance training, all to be done multiple times. On top of that, there is a meticulously timed nutrition and sleep plan that even takes into account time for school and studying. Izuku will do nothing but eat, sleep, study, and train for the next 10 months. "This is going to be damn hard," he whispers to himself. But deep down, he knows that All Might is right. He is unusually weak for his age, and if he wants even the slightest chance of passing the UA entrance exam, he has to push himself to his limits and beyond. Should I tell Mom about this? He wonders aloud when a familiar voice suddenly pulls him out of his thoughts. "What are you telling me?" Izuku jumps in fright and lets out an embarrassingly small scream when he suddenly sees his mother standing behind him. "Oh. Mom, I didn't realize you'd come home. How was work?" Inko puts her hands on her hips and gives him a searching look. "Don't try to distract me now. What happened?" Izuku can tell from her determined expression that she won't be fobbed off with a half-baked answer. After a short sigh, he begins to tell his mother what he has experienced, but leaves out the part about Bakugo. Inko's facial expression changes constantly as Izuku tells his story, from almost crying to incredulous horror. She obviously struggles with herself not to interrupt him while he recounts the incredible events. When he finally finishes, she takes a deep breath and says in a trembling voice, "Oh, Izu, you must have been terribly afraid when that villain attacked you." Luckily, All Might was nearby. Izuku can see her eyes glistening with tears, but he is impressed by her restraint. It wouldn't be the first time he had seen his mother almost flood half the apartment with far less dramatic events. Suddenly, he remembers All Might's autograph. Hastily, he digs out the scorched notebook and holds it out to her. "Mom, I got an autograph from All Might," he says, his voice trembling with pride and excitement. Inko's face lights up, her eyes shine, even though tears are still gathering in them. "That's fantastic, Izuku. You have to frame that," she says, smiling with joy, but also concern. A little embarrassed, Izuku turns to the pages with the American Dream Plan and shows it to her. "All Might gave me some tips on how to become a hero. It's a training plan," he explains. Inko wrinkles her forehead slightly, her confusion clearly visible. "Why did he give you tips on becoming a hero?" Izuku lowers his gaze, his face growing hot, and answers quietly, "After he saved me, I asked him if I," his voice breaks, and he takes a deep breath to continue. "If I can become a hero even with a useless quirk." "Oh, Izuku, of course you can," Inko immediately exclaims, her voice warm and full of compassion. But Izuku hears the doubt she tries to hide, like a slight dissonance in her words. She would never say that she doesn't believe in it herself, but her doubt still hurts him. He forces a smile and says softly, "Thank you, Mom." But inside, he feels the sting of the unspoken doubt gnawing at him. Later that evening, Izuku sits at his desk and carefully transfers the American Dream Plan into a new notebook. Every letter he writes reminds him of the daunting challenge that lies ahead, but at the same time he feels a spark of hope. It is a mixture of determination and nervousness that drives him. On the front page, he writes in big letters, "The American Dream Plan." Izuku carefully takes the original notebook, which contains All Might's precious autograph, in his hands. Taking a deep breath, he opens it and looks for the double-sided page with the signature. His fingers tremble slightly as he removes it with the utmost care. He doesn't want to risk damaging the signature. He gently smooths out the page and places it in a simple picture frame that he found in his room. He carefully hangs the frame on the wall above his desk, where he can always see it. It is more than just an autograph, it is a symbol of his dream and confirmation that he has been seen by someone he admires. He puts the damaged notebook aside while he admires the framed treasure once more. The sight gives him new courage, and a slight smile crosses his face. Beginning of April. On the first morning of his training, Izuku's alarm clock rings relentlessly at 5 o'clock in the morning. The shrill tone cuts through the silence of his room, and with a soft groan he opens his eyes. Everything in him cries out to pull the covers over his head and turn back time. But the thought of All Might won't leave him. With a deep breath, he pushes aside the heavy tiredness. With trembling legs, he pushes himself out of bed, his movements slow and uncertain, as if gravity itself has him in its sights. Izuku puts on his sports shoes, grabs a light jacket and steps out into the cold, clear morning air. A shiver runs through him, but he straightens his shoulders. This is his first step, his journey to becoming a hero. His training plan is merciless, a 10-kilometer run followed by strength exercises such as sit-ups, push-ups, and pull-ups. On top of that, he has a strict diet and sleep schedule that leaves little room for leisure time. Izuku is aware that it will be hard. But his dream of becoming a hero is stronger than any doubt. "I can do this," he whispers as he takes the first steps. The cold burns in his lungs, and after a few hundred meters his legs feel like they're made of lead. The icy wind bites his face, and he has to force himself to keep going. After barely a kilometer, he stops, panting, hands on his knees. Sweat runs into his eyes, burning and blurring his vision. Is that all I can do? The words taste bitter, and for a moment he wants to give up. But a small, stubborn voice inside him whispers, "I'll get better. It won't be easy, but I'll get stronger." He forces himself to keep going step by step, but the truth is unavoidable. He won't be able to do the 10 kilometers in front of the school. And he certainly won't be able to do the other exercises either. In his mind, he is already starting to revise the training plan. "It will take me a while to complete the workload," he admits to himself. The doubts creep up again. What if All Might expects me to do all the exercises from the start? Maybe I'm weaker than he thought. The thought stabs his heart like a dagger. But Izuku shakes it off. "I can't give up. I'll do what I can, a little more every day." He returns home completely exhausted, his legs shaking under him like a house of cards in the wind. ᴡᴇ'ʟ Midoriya is already standing in the kitchen, eyeing her son with a strange expression, a mixture of pride and concern. "Izuku, are you sure this isn't too much for you?" Her voice is gentle but worried. "I'll manage, Mom," he replies with an exhausted smile. His eyes sparkle with determination despite his tiredness, and something in that look makes her sigh and hand him a cup of warm tea. "I made breakfast," she says, while Izuku pounces on it with a ravenous hunger she has never seen him experience before. Luckily, Inko has cooked more than usual today. He's going to need a lot of strength, she thinks as she watches him. She silently decides to double the portions in the future. Her son has decided on something big, and she will support him as best she can. The days pass, and Izuku adheres strictly to the plan. He runs in the morning, then goes to school, and in the afternoon he does his strengthening exercises. After school, he retreats to his room to do push-ups, while his mother sometimes listens curiously at the door. His progress is barely visible at first, but he can feel his body slowly becoming stronger and responding to the strain. However, Izuku encounters difficulties when it comes to strength training. Many of the exercises All Might wrote down for him require special equipment. Presumably, all might assume that Izuku could go to the gym, but this is an option that is unthinkable for Izuku. The risk of running into Bakugo or his friends there is far too great. So he chooses remote routes for his runs and trains in the backyard of their apartment building as soon as the neighbors can't watch him. On one of his runs, which takes him across the city, Izuku stops at Takoba Beach. Breathing heavily, he looks at the neglected beach that spreads out before him. Wow, what a dump! I haven't been here in years, but it looks even worse than before. His eyes wander over the mountains of rubbish, old tires, rusted metal parts, scrap of all kinds. Is that a refrigerator back there? For a moment, Izuku stops as if rooted to the spot. Then an idea occurs to him. For some of the exercises in All Might's plan, I need tires, and there are more than enough of them lying around here. Maybe I could do some of the exercises here? He lets his eyes wander over the mountains of rubbish again. Away from the main paths, there are secret paths and clearings where he could be undisturbed. No one would notice me behind the rubbish. And the heavy parts and the uneven sand are perfect for training strength and endurance. Determined, Izuku begins to incorporate the beach into his training plan. He drags old tires over and uses them to build an obstacle course. He pulls rusted metal parts through the sand and stacks them. The weight of the debris challenges his strength, and the uneven ground challenges his balance. At first, Izuku is pleased that his new environment is giving his training a fresh boost. The tire obstacle course improves his agility, and the heavy parts are effective strength training. But after a few days, when he sits exhausted on a pile of garbage, Izuku stares thoughtfully at the chaos around him. It would be great if I could also clean up the beach while training, he mutters to himself. The thought won't leave him. The garbage is not only a challenge for his strength, it is also an opportunity to make a difference. At dinner, Izuku tells his mother about his newfound training ground. I'm training at Takoba Beach now, he says between bites, his eyes glowing with excitement. There's so much heavy stuff to lug there, it's perfect for my training. Inko stops what she is doing, carefully puts down the chopsticks and looks at him with a mixture of concern and thoughtfulness. Oh, Izuku, please be careful when you train there, she finally says, her voice gentle but worried. A beach full of garbage can be dangerous, sharp edges, unstable piles. I'm worried. I'll be careful, Mom. But you know, it's really a shame that the beach looks like this. I'm always lugging tires and scrap parts around, so it would make sense to clean up the beach a little at the same time. Inko wrinkles her forehead slightly as she thoughtfully lifts her teacup. She doesn't answer right away, but seems to be pondering something. Izuku notices this, but decides not to pursue the topic further, and the conversation soon turns back to his training. A few days later, at dinner, Inko brings up the subject again on her own initiative. You know, Izuku, she begins, looking at him with a slight smile, we had a meeting at work this week. The city government asked us if we had any suggestions for improving the city a bit. Izuku looks up, his interest piqued. And did you suggest anything? Well, she continues, her voice a bit more lively, I mentioned Takoba Beach. It's really in a terrible state, and has been for years. I suggested putting up a few large containers there. Maybe that would help to keep people from dumping even more trash, and local residents could dispose of their own waste there. Izuku blinks in surprise. That's a great idea, Mama. What did they say? Inko smiles slightly and shrugs, but her eyes sparkle with a mixture of pride and caution. They like the idea and want to try it. I heard that the containers are supposed to be delivered in the next few days. Izuku beams at her, barely able to contain his excitement. That's great, Mom. This will help me clean up the beach while I train. Inko smiles and puts a hand on his. I'm glad you like the idea. But still, take care of yourself, okay? And don't overexert yourself. I promise. Izuku grins, his eyes glowing with energy. While he picks up his chopsticks again, Inko lets her gaze drift into the distance for a moment, a slight expression of contentment on her face. A few days later, the containers are actually set up. When Izuku sees them for the first time, he can hardly believe it. The large, sturdy metal containers are ready and waiting on the promenade, and he can finally properly dispose of the chaos he drags through the sand. His gaze wanders to the steps leading down from the promenade to the beach. Up and down the steps every time, that's perfect training for my legs. A determined look comes over his face. Now I can not only move the trash, but also get rid of it, and challenge myself even more while doing so. With renewed motivation, he throws himself into the work. He drags old tires through the sand, lifts rusty metal parts, and even moves heavy chunks of concrete that are stuck deep in the sand. While he is dragging a particularly large and heavy piece of metal, he suddenly curses, "People really do dispose of every damn thing here." At that moment, the piece of metal slips out of his hands and falls with a dull thud into the sand. Izuku freezes, quickly puts his hands over his mouth and looks around frantically. His heart is pounding faster. Oh no, if Mama had heard that, the thought of her stern look and her admonishing words brings a blush to his face. He pauses for a moment, takes a deep breath, and then picks up the piece of metal again. "Focus, Izuku," he mutters, getting back to work. With each day he spends here, the clearings in the garbage get a little bigger. Some open spaces were there before, but Izuku expands them, taking great care to keep his training ground hidden behind the largest piles of garbage. The promenade must not see what he is doing here, he does not want to have to explain himself. The work is hard. His hands get sore and his arms hurt more and more each day. But with every step, every ascent and descent to the containers, he feels a little stronger. It is as if the beach is shaping him as well as changing him. With every load he disposes of, the beach gets a little cleaner, and Izuku feels his body becoming more resilient. After a few weeks, he notices the first changes. His arms look more defined, his shoulders broader. His legs feel stronger and his stamina has improved noticeably. He is still far from being able to run 10 kilometers without a break, but he knows he is on the right track. At the end of the first month, Izuku pauses, leans against one of the containers and lets his gaze wander over the beach. The garbage is far from gone, but the clearings he has created immediately catch his eye. The sight fills him with pride. This is just the beginning, he thinks, clenching his fists. He feels the strength in his arms and knows that with hard work, he can achieve anything. End of May. Izuku feels more confident with every day of training. Whether he is walking the streets or doing his exercises in the backyard, the conviction that he is getting stronger grows steadily. The cold morning hours are gradually becoming milder, making training more pleasant. But for a few days now, he has sensed that something is wrong. His performance is declining. His legs feel as heavy as lead, and he tries to ignore the constant pulling in his back as best he can. "Heroes don't give up," he mutters to himself again and again. Maybe it's the skipped rest days. His mother has admonished him several times about this, but he soon deleted the breaks from his plan. If he wants to achieve his goal in the next 8 months, he can't afford any interruption, at least that's what he keeps telling himself. The stinging in his legs and arms gets stronger every day, but Izuku shakes off the thought of it. Giving up is not an option. On a particularly exhausting evening, exhaustion hits him with full force. After the last exercise, he sinks to the floor, breathing heavily, unable to get up again. Sweat is pouring down his face and his breathing is labored. A sharp pain shoots through his right leg, as if a glowing nail were being driven through his muscle. He groans in agony. Just as he tries to sit up, the door opens and his mother storms in. Her eyes are filled with panic when she sees him. "Izuku! What happened?" Her voice is high and tense as she kneels next to him. "It's nothing," he mutters. But his expression tells a different story. Inko frowns before helping him to sit up straight. "This doesn't look like nothing," she replies sharply. Without saying another word, she goes to the kitchen, gets an ice pack and gently places it on his aching leg. "Izuku, you're overdoing it. You promised to stick to All Might's plan. And that plan includes breaks, for a reason." Izuku remains silent. The silence between them is only interrupted by his irregular breathing. Finally, he reluctantly nods. "Okay. I'll take a break." But Inko is not finished yet. With a serious expression, she folds her arms across her chest. "A break alone is not enough. You will take a complete break for the next few days. I'll call the school and report you sick. But mama, Izuku begins, but his mother's determined look immediately silences him. Yes, mama. The next morning shows that a break alone would not have been enough. Every attempt to put weight on his leg ends in a sharp pain that almost forces Izuku to the ground. His mother, who is watching his every move warily, pushes him back onto the couch with determination and crosses her arms over her chest. You stay here and rest so I can keep an eye on you, she explains with an unyielding tone. I thought you had to work today, Izuku asks in surprise, while he leans back with difficulty. I switched a few shifts yesterday so I could be here, she replies calmly but firmly. Her gaze is like that of a hawk guarding its nest, and Izuku knows that any attempt to change her mind would be futile. He hates to sit still, but deep down he knows she's right. He has no choice but to abide by his mother's strict rules. The following days drag on endlessly. Izuku lies on the couch for hours, staring out the window and watching the clouds drift by and the swaying tree branches in the wind. The feeling of missing out gnaws at him like a stubborn pain. The restlessness grows with every hour he can't train. His mother even forbade him from studying so that he could fully concentrate on his recovery. But as time went on and the pain slowly subsided, he realized how badly his body needed this recovery. A small consolation, but at least a consolation. On the first day he is able to move around freely again, Izuku decides to cook something for himself and his mother. It is his way of feeling useful and thanking her for taking such good care of him. In the kitchen, Izuku hums softly to himself as he chops vegetables and prepares the stove. The aroma of fried vegetables, meat, and freshly cooked rice fills the small apartment, creating a warm, homely atmosphere. As Izuku reaches for the soy sauce on a shelf above him, he accidentally bumps the shelf with his elbow. A row of spice bottles begins to sway. Oh no, he cries out in fright as they slowly begin to tip over. He reflexively reaches out to catch them, but his muscles are still too sluggish to react in time. At that moment, a strange feeling runs through him. His energy shoots through his arm into the palm of his hand, and before he can comprehend it, a turquoise light flashes. With a soft whoosh, an oval disc of light forms in the air in front of him. With another gentle whoosh from each bottle, they disappear without a trace into the disc, and before Izuku can understand what just happened, the apparition dissolves just as quickly. He stares with wide-open eyes at the spot where the window was a moment ago. His heart is racing and his breathing is labored. What was that? He whispers, unable to comprehend what he has seen. Izuku? His mother's voice pulls him out of his stupor. Inko has rushed into the kitchen, her eyes searching the room with concern. Are you all right? Slowly, he turns to her, his hand still outstretched as if he wants to grasp what just happened. Mom! I think I just had a breakthrough with my weirdness. What exactly happened? Her voice is a mixture of concern and impatient curiosity as she steps closer. I'm not sure exactly. I'll try again. With a mixture of uncertainty and determination, Izuku raises his hand again. At first, nothing happens. On the second attempt, turquoise sparks flash, but it is only on the third attempt that another disc appears with a gentle whoosh. This time Izuku can take a closer look at it. An oval, turquoise ring of energy that rotates slowly in a clockwise direction. The inner surface glows like mirror-smooth light, a fascinating mixture of turquoise and white. There it is! Izuku exclaims enthusiastically. But his joy is short-lived, because with a loud clanking sound, the bottles that had previously disappeared into the pane shoot back uncontrollably and smash on the kitchen floor. Shortly thereafter, the pane dissolves again with a soft whoosh, and an oppressive silence settles over the small kitchen. Izuku stares at the shards on the floor before slowly raising his eyes to look at his mother. Her eyes are wide open in amazement, but then a gentle smile crosses her face. Izuku, that's incredible. It felt like, he whispers, unsure how to describe what he has experienced. Finally, he begins to pick up the shards. A little louder and with an apologetic look in the direction of his mother, he says, I'm sorry the bottles broke. I didn't mean to. Inko kneels down next to him and starts to help him. It's not a problem, Izuku. It was the first time you've used your quirk in this way. You know, as a child, I almost put out an eye when I tried to pull scissors towards me with my quirk. She smiles encouragingly at him. you'll learn to control it. But maybe you shouldn't practice with fragile things. Izuku nods, and a small smile crosses his face. Yes, you're right. I have to practice, but first I'll finish dinner. After dinner has been prepared and enjoyed together, Izuku breaks the pleasant silence at the table. While cooking, I had a few ideas that I want to try out. I think a paper towel roll would be good, it can't do any harm. Inko frowns. Don't you want to do that tomorrow, Izuku? You're still exhausted from your excessive training, she says with a concerned undertone. I don't feel exhausted at all, Izuku begins, but he immediately realizes that this is the wrong answer. His mother's serious look returns immediately. Still, his curiosity prevents him from just giving up. I know you're worried I'll overdo it, but please, Mom, just one more try today, okay? He gives her his best puppy dog eyes, and Inko finally gives in with a sigh. All right, Izuku. But just one more try, and then you're resting until tomorrow, no matter what. Izuku beams with joy. Thanks, Mom. Izuku holds the kitchen roll in one hand while concentrating his energy in the other. This time, he wants to open the second slice further away, exactly at the couch, which is a few meters away from him. He fixes his gaze on the desired point and recalls the feeling that flowed through him the first time. Slowly, he reaches out his hand. It happens immediately. With a soft whoosh, the turquoise disc appears in front of him, and to his surprise, a second one opens at the same moment, right next to the couch, exactly where he is aiming. Izuku stares in amazement for a brief moment, then he doesn't hesitate any longer. He throws the kitchen roll into the first disc in a gentle arc. A soft, whispering sound accompanies the moment the paper roll disappears through the first pane. Without any visible delay, it shoots out of the second pane with a soft whoosh and lands gently on the couch. It's perfect. This time, Izuku can feel his energy decreasing noticeably. He immediately cuts off the energy flow, and just as he had hoped, both panes instantly disappear. Mom, he begins, staring in fascination at the palm of his outstretched hand, which is still surrounded by a faint turquoise glow. His voice is little more than a whisper, imbued with a mixture of awe and nervousness. I think I can create portals with my quirk. His heart beats like a drum roll, and his thoughts race. Dozens of scenarios flash through his mind, countless possibilities for how he could use this ability. The moment feels like he's been torn out of a dream, surreal, but so incredibly real. The soft glow on his hand makes him believe that anything is possible. Oh, Izuku, that's fantastic! Inko exclaims with radiant joy and claps her hands enthusiastically. She quickly bridges the distance to her son and pulls him into a tight embrace. Izuku, I'm so happy for you. You've been waiting for this for so long, and her voice breaks and tears run down her face as she hugs him even tighter. Izuku thinks once again that his mother must have two quirks. The amount of tears she can produce is just not normal. Maybe she unconsciously uses her ability to draw moisture out of the air. Mom, it's all right, he tries to calm her down, while gently patting her on the back. It takes a full 5 minutes before Inko finally pulls herself together. With a slight sob, she finally says, maybe your classmates and teachers will leave you alone now that you have such a special quirk. Izumo's face becomes serious. Mom, you know. I think it would be better if I didn't tell anyone at school about it. It's probably best to keep my quirk a secret for now. Inko frowns. What do you mean, Izuku? Why don't you want to tell anyone? We also need to see the quirk doctor to update your quirk registry. I don't know the limits of my portals yet, Izuku explains calmly. But quirks that can transport things or maybe even people are extremely rare. Even internationally. I wouldn't be surprised if the government suddenly showed up on our doorstep as soon as we report this to the doctor and wanted to put me in some kind of secret program. Izuku, don't exaggerate. Inko protests in dismay. The government would never do such a thing. That only happens in the movies. Besides, it's against the law not to register a quirk. Izuku grins crookedly and replies with a hint of impudence, my quirk is registered. The portals are just a, side effect of my power. And as for the government, well, there are some rumors about that on the internet. It doesn't hurt to play it safe. Inko sighs deeply and puts a hand to her cheek. Before she can say anything, Izuku continues, "Mom, it's going to be okay. I don't know exactly what I can do with the portals myself yet. You don't have to run immediately and adjust the registration for every new aspect. They'll update my file after the entrance exam for the UA at the latest anyway. And once I start attending the UA, I won't have to worry about the government anymore." He mutters softly, barely audible, "assuming I pass the exam." Inko looks at her son thoughtfully and sighs again. After a moment's consideration, she finally nods hesitantly. "All right, Izuku. Let's keep it to ourselves for now, but please be careful." Mid-June. Due to his impulsive behavior, Izuku has lost several weeks of training. It took 2 weeks for him to recover enough to even start training again. That morning, he went for his usual jog and clearly felt how much his stamina had decreased. The level he had before his breakdown now seems unattainable to him. His mother has forbidden him from using his new ability as a precaution while he is still recovering. The ban annoyed him, but he knew that protests would have been futile. Izuku is eager to finally train with his quirk, but that will have to wait until after school. He has trouble completing his usual running route in time for school. The school day drags on excruciatingly slowly. Teachers largely ignore him, except for the occasional small taunt. Bakugo is neither more hostile nor friendlier than usual. The temptation to show his new ability to the teachers and students is great. How he would love to see the surprised faces, but he holds back. His mother is probably right. If he revealed his abilities, the teachers would no longer humiliate him or allow him to be bullied. They would probably even favor him just as much as Bakugo, whose ability is extremely rare. Izuku could only find very few heroes on the internet who can transport things without a noticeable time delay. His classmates would probably want to be friends with him too. At this thought, Izuku's stomach turns. They wouldn't be real friends, and in his eyes, it is this unjust favoritism that has turned Bakugo into an arrogant, overbearing asshole. Izuku doesn't want to become like that. He is convinced that Bakugo could have become a better person if people had treated him more like everyone else and not like something special. So it came as it probably had to come. Bakugo quickly saw himself as special. Every time he was showered with praise or given preferential treatment, the idea that he was above everyone else took root in Bakugo's mind until this worldview became an incontrovertible fact for him. Nevertheless, a doubt gnawed at Izuku. Perhaps it was just his envy speaking. Izuku longs for a real friend. His mother is great, but she can't replace a friend his own age. At UA, he would meet many people with impressive and powerful quirks. Hopefully he can make friends there. In the afternoon, just before school lets out, Izuku prepares for his usual race against time. Since he started his training, he has been able to escape Bakugo and his cronies more and more often. But Bakugo is one of the fastest students in the school and shows impressive abilities to adapt to every new situation. As soon as Izuku tries a new escape route, Bakugo analyzes every possible weakness. He strategically positions his people from other classes at various exits and has some on patrol, so Izuku is often forced to improvise on the fly. Bakugo even manages to get his class to stay a few minutes longer at the end of the day, which gives his people enough time to get into position. Bakugo enjoys a lot of freedom, but even he can't attack Izuku directly in the classroom or in the hallways. After all, the teachers have to be able to credibly deny that they saw anything. Bakugo and his friends used to just wait at the main gate, but since Izuku learned to climb over the school walls, they've adjusted their tactics and positioned themselves at all the possible exits. In a direct race, Izuku has no chance against Bakugo. That's why he focuses on avoiding any confrontation with him. Either he avoids everyone, or he specifically looks for certain cronies, from whom he can now escape most of the time. But when he encounters Bakugo himself or is cornered, he has to endure the latter's anger. Today, it is particularly close. They have positioned themselves at all the exits, and Izuku is forced to climb through a window to leave the building unseen. But one of Bakugo's faster cronies spots him and immediately takes off in pursuit. Izuku runs as fast as he can across the yard. His heart is beating way too fast for the short sprint, and he curses his waning stamina inside. His pursuer is catching up quickly. A few more meters to the wall. Izuku jumps and grabs the top edge with his fingers. As he pulls himself up, he feels a slight tug on his uniform. Without looking, he kicks out backwards, like a startled horse. The grip on his uniform loosens, and Izuku pulls himself over the wall with his last ounce of strength. He lands on the other side, panting. His thoughts race. He knows he has to be especially careful in the next few weeks. He probably hit his pursuer hard. That will only increase Bakugo's anger, although it increases anyway every time Izuku escapes him. It's only a matter of time before Bakugo catches up with him. Finally back, Izuku mutters with relief as he stands in his favorite clearing on the beach. Everything is exactly as he left it. But his gaze falls on the containers. They are noticeably fuller than before. A satisfied smile crosses his face. Apparently people are using the containers and no longer disposing of their garbage directly on the beach. Before he starts his workout, Izuku decides to finally do some tests with his quirk. During his recovery time, he planned various experiments, but now that he is actually starting to do them, he feels unsure. What should he try first? Finally, he decides to start with something easy. First, he makes sure that no one on the promenade can see him. His eyes scan the area carefully before he sets his sights on an undamaged bottle lying on the ground a few meters away. It's the perfect target. Izuku takes a deep breath, shakes off his nervousness, and focuses. Slowly, he raises his hand, opens his palm, and points it at the bottle. He feels his energy flowing into his hand. The familiar tingling sensation spreads, and with a soft whoosh, a small, turquoise glowing portal forms right next to the bottle. A feeling of triumph washes over him, and a satisfied smile spreads across his face. He slowly lowers his hand, but his concentration remains unbroken. The portal remains stable, shimmering calmly. After a few seconds, however, Izuku feels how it gradually draws energy from his body. The effect is not overwhelming, but it is clearly noticeable. In order not to exhaust himself, he decides to quickly complete the experiment. Taking a deep breath, he raises his other hand and concentrates on creating a second portal directly in front of him. With another quiet whisper, the second portal opens exactly where Izuku aimed it. To his amazement, he notices that two connected portals consume less energy together than if they were opened independently. Izuku frowns, fascinated by this unexpected behavior of his quirk, but he shakes himself briefly when he realizes that he is daydreaming. With a curious sparkle in his eyes, he turns his attention back to the bottle. He slowly extends his hand through the second portal and watches with fascination as it seamlessly emerges from the first portal next to the bottle. It feels completely normal, as if his hand is simply making a normal movement. No tingling, no pressure, nothing to indicate that it is being guided through a portal. He is thrilled by the precision and simplicity of this ability. With a broad grin, he clasps the bottle, carefully pulling it back through the portal and making both portals disappear. The portals dissolve simultaneously with a gentle whoosh. Izuku holds the bottle triumphantly in his hand and looks at it as if it were a small, well-deserved trophy. It works, he murmurs contentedly. It's only a first step, but this success gives him the feeling that he is on the right track. His portals prove to be precise tools that he is slowly but surely beginning to control. A spark of anticipation arises in him. How far can he develop this ability? Izuku is thrilled with his experiment, not only because it was successful, but also because of the insights he was able to gain from it. With just one experiment, he has learned several important things about his quirk. He now knows that his portals can also transport living things. He has also discovered that objects can pass through a portal even partially without being damaged or losing their functionality. His arm feels completely normal after the experiment. He is particularly fascinated by the discovery that two connected portals consume less energy together than he had expected. Izuku's mind is full of ideas for further testing his quirk. Perhaps he could study the stability of portals over longer periods of time. Expanding the size of his portals is particularly appealing. Could he make them large enough to fit through himself? Just thinking about it makes his whole body tingle with excitement. If he can do it, his quirk would give him impressive mobility. Determined to test just that next, Izuku focuses on creating a larger portal, just large enough for himself to pass through. With growing effort, he channels his energy, feeling it pulsing through his body, and he does indeed manage to open a larger portal. But no sooner has it been created than he is overcome by a strong dizziness. His vision blurs and a sharp pain shoots through his temples. The world around him tilts and he falls powerlessly into the sand. The outlines of the beach become more and more diffuse until they finally disappear completely into nothingness. The incessant vibrating of his cell phone pulls Izuku out of unconsciousness. He struggles to sit up, and a throbbing pain runs through his temples. His head feels heavy, as if crushed by an invisible weight, and a dull weakness paralyzes his body. Blinking, he realizes that it is already dawn. The setting sun bathes the beach in a warm, orange glow. The peaceful scene contrasts sharply with his inner state. With shaky hands, he digs the cell phone out of his pocket, which is still vibrating insistently. When he sees the caller's name on the display, adrenaline shoots through his body. It's his mother. Right above it, the time shows the obvious reason for her call. He is over half an hour late. Izuku takes a deep breath, forces himself to remain calm, and answers the call. Izuku, where are you? I'm very worried. Inko's voice echoes tensely and tinnily from the loudspeaker. I'm sorry, Mom. I lost track of time, Izuku quickly lies, while pressing a hand to his throbbing forehead. There's no way he can tell her that he passed out because he overused his quirk. She would confine him to bed for weeks and forbid him from training. I'm on my way. I'll be right there, he hastily adds, glancing across the beach to make sure he hasn't forgotten anything. I hope so for your sake. If you're not home in 10 minutes, you're grounded, his mother declares sharply before hanging up. Izuku groans softly and gets moving. 10 minutes would be more than just cutting it. His legs feel like they're made of lead, and every step makes the throbbing pain in his head worse. But he ignores the exhaustion and forces himself to run faster. With his last ounce of strength, Izuku makes it home just in time. Breathing heavily, he closes the door behind him. His mother is already standing in the hallway, hands on her hips, her eyes full of concern and quiet anger. I'm sorry, Mom. It won't happen again, Izuku mutters, looking at the floor. His voice is weak and he has to lean against the wall to keep from falling over. Inko's facial features relax slightly as she takes a closer look at him. Izuku, you look terrible, she says, her anger slowly giving way to concern in her voice. She steps closer and puts a hand on his forehead. You're completely pale. Did you overdo it again today? Izuku hastily shakes his head, although it makes him dizzy. No, Mom, I just practiced too long. He forces a weak smile. I'm just tired. His mother sighs, and the tension on her face gradually disappears. You're old enough to take care of yourself, Izuku. But I don't want you to overexert yourself again. Your health is important. Izuku nods guiltily. I promise, Mom. She watches him for a moment before shaking her head and putting on a small, exhausted smile. Go to your room and rest. I'll bring you some more dinner in a minute. It sounds more like an order than an offer, but the strictness in her tone has almost disappeared. Gratefully, Izuku nods and drags himself to his room. There he collapses on his bed. His head is throbbing and his muscles feel weak. As he stares at the ceiling, he resolves to take better care of his energy in the future. He needs to approach his experiments with more care and thought. It's a lesson he hopes he'll remember. At the beginning of July, Izuku's daily routine is characterized by discipline and constant repetition. It takes a week before he performs as well as he did before his breakdown. Day after day, he trains in his room, creating small portals and sending books through them. Several times he reaches his limits and is in danger of losing consciousness, but each time he manages to stop in time. Over time, Izuku realizes that his energy reserves grow when he pushes his limits to the extreme. This realization leads him to deliberately exhaust himself to the point of fainting every day. In doing so, he not only develops a better sense of his mysterious energy, but also of his own limits. Izuku wants to find a more fitting name for this energy at some point. There are already dozens of crossed-out ideas in his notebook, but none of them seem good enough to him so far. The constant improvement fills him with unbridled motivation. It shows him that his hard work is paying off and that he is still at the very beginning of his journey. During the summer vacation, he devotes himself to improving his endurance, muscle strength, and energy reserves, as well as cleaning the beach. During his days off, Izuku uses the time to learn as much as he possibly can, because the UA requires a much higher level of education than Eldorahai. Without Bakugo and his gang, who would otherwise constantly harass him, Izuku can train and study undisturbed. He spends almost every free minute at the beach or running. He only returns home to eat, sleep, and study. In the second week of the summer vacation, Izuku manages to create about 10 portals per day. For the first time, he feels strong enough to create a portal in his own size. Izuku plans to conduct this experiment on the beach, where he has more space than in his room. But every day, his small, hidden clearing becomes more conspicuous. While the piles of garbage slowly disappear in other parts of the beach, the ones around his clearing remain untouched. This way, he can continue to protect himself from prying eyes. Nevertheless, Izuku realizes that the beach will soon no longer be suitable as a training ground. He sees more and more people walking on the promenade. Just a month ago, there was hardly anyone here except for the residents. Still, he doesn't want to stop cleaning the beach. The occasional passerby gives him the feeling that people care about the state of the beach. In the last few weeks, Izuku has made such great progress in using his portals that it hardly takes any effort for him to create them at any point within his field of vision. Keeping them open is also easier for him, and he hardly has to concentrate on it. Nevertheless, he sets an alarm clock for the experiment as a precaution, so as not to remain unconscious for too long in the event of a faint. Although he considers this unnecessary, since he can now estimate the energy consumption of his quirk well, he wants to be on the safe side. With firm determination, Izuku creates a portal the size of himself. As the turquoise glow takes shape before him, a wave of pride and excitement washes over him. His heart beats faster. For a moment, he is simply fascinated by the elegance of his own creation and remains silent and motionless for a few seconds. Then he can feel the portals draining his energy. Creating the larger portal costs him considerably more energy, while keeping it open requires hardly more energy than the smaller portals. This insight is extremely valuable to him. However, when his energy level drops dangerously low, he decides not to hesitate any longer, but to go through immediately. With 2 quiet whooshes it is already over. Izuku cuts the energy supply, and the portals close instantly. A brief swaying, accompanied by slight dizziness, makes him drop to his knees. "That was close, it wasn't much more," he mutters, panting. After the dizziness has subsided after a few seconds, Izuku gets up with a broad grin. His quirk has just reached a new level. His thoughts race as he imagines the myriad ways in which his quirk could save lives. Access to hard-to-reach places, the quick removal of debris, or the provision of important equipment. The possibilities seem endless. In the following weeks of the summer vacation, Izuku works hard to further increase his energy reserves. Soon he starts using his portals to clean up the beach as well. The large dumpsters are not visible from the street. People either throw their trash over the edge of the containers or use the metal stairs next to them. Izuku can open his portals directly into the container without fear of anyone noticing them. He has tried several times to open his portals in places out of his field of vision, but so far he has not yet succeeded. His next idea works a little better at first. He creates a single portal on the beach without an exit, into which he throws the garbage, like into a kind of garbage bag. Finally, he wants to create the second portal in the container and unload the garbage. But his quirk throws a spanner in the works. Izuku hadn't noticed it during his first attempt with the kitchen roll, but now that he's throwing more and more rubbish into it, he notices that the portal consumes more energy with each piece of rubbish that passes through. Even when he closes the portal, the energy loss does not stop. Izuku begins to feel anxious. His already closed portal is draining his energy at an alarming rate. He tries to walk to the container, but after a few steps, he realizes that he won't make it. Fear quickly turns to panic. What will happen to him if he runs out of energy before he gets rid of the garbage? In desperation, Izuku hastily opens a new portal, and immediately all the garbage flies out. After that, Izuku collapses on his knees in the sand, exhausted. The enormous energy consumption has completely drained him. It takes Izuku several minutes for his panic to subside. As he finally rises from the sand, he mutters, "I'll have to be much more careful in the future if I want to use my quirk this way." Determined to learn from his mistake, he decides to take it easy for the rest of the day. The next day, Izuku tries a different strategy. First, he goes to the containers and creates a single portal there. Then he returns to the beach and opens the second portal there. He now throws the garbage directly into the portal on the beach, where it instantly lands in the container. On his first attempt, Izuku can only keep the portal open for a few minutes before the energy runs out. But over time, he manages to significantly increase the duration. He is convinced that if he continues to train, he will soon be able to maintain his portals for hours. While cleaning up, Izuku continues to experiment with his portals and discovers something surprising. When he doubles the diameter of his portals, the energy consumption quadruples. The consumption of the connection, on the other hand, increases evenly, regardless of the size of the portals. This insight gives him valuable clues for the efficient use of his quirk. After a few days, Izuku notices another useful feature of his portals. Instead of closing both portals at the same time, he can leave one open and create a new entrance. This method opens up new possibilities for him and also saves energy and time. From this point on, cleaning up the beach is much faster. It becomes particularly efficient when Izuku stops throwing the garbage through the portals and instead opens the portals directly under the garbage. Gravity does the rest. Using this method, Izuku cleans the beach at a breathtaking speed. However, he encounters a new problem in the process. The containers become a bottleneck because they are emptied no more than once a day. The last Monday of the summer vacation begins quite normally for Izuku. He runs his morning route, has breakfast with his mother, and then heads to the beach. But even from a distance, he notices the increasing noise. The closer he gets, the louder it gets. Such a noise level is unusual in this quiet neighborhood, and Izuku wonders what could be causing it. When he finally turns the last corner, he sees the source of the commotion. The entire beach is full of people. Most of them are holding garbage bags or buckets in one hand and tongs in the other. Izuku walks slowly to the promenade and looks at the crowd. "I probably won't be able to train here today," he mutters to himself. His gaze remains fixed on his clearing, which is now barely recognizable as such. His feelings are mixed. On the one hand, he is annoyed that the beach is no longer available to him, even though he would have cleaned it completely by the end of the week at the latest. On the other hand, he is secretly pleased that so many people are working together on it. Izuku wonders if he might have inspired them to do so. His thoughts are suddenly interrupted when a young woman with short, bright red hair stands before him. Her round, mouse-like ears twitch slightly, and a friendly smile plays around her lips. She is wearing a bright vest and sturdy gloves that show she is ready to lend a hand. "Hello, are you here to help too?" she asks, while she swings a garbage bag lightly back and forth in her hand. Izuku's gaze falls on the writing on her vest, which shows the name Nezamimi Cafe. He remembers noticing the cafe on his way to the beach several times. Izuku feels his heart beating up to his throat. The young woman waits patiently for an answer, while his cloth ears nervously move to his head. He tugs restlessly at his hat. Yes. I thought I could help a little," he finally says, without looking her in the eye. "That's great. Every helping hand counts." She smiles warmly and doesn't seem to notice how much her friendly manner is unsettling Izuku. "By the way, I'm Akari Chika. I run the little cafe on the promenade over there. We organized the campaign after we noticed that someone had been cleaning the beach bit by bit." Izuku freezes for a moment, but forces himself to remain calm. "Oh, really? That's great," he mutters quietly, still avoiding looking directly at Akari. She nods and lets her gaze sweep across the beach. "Yes, someone has already done a lot of work here. An enormous amount of rubbish has been disposed of, especially in the last few days. It's impressive how much has already been cleaned up before we started. So much effort, and yet the person who did it never showed up. She smiles pensively, as if she is sharing this thought more with herself than with him. Izuku remains silent, but he can feel his cheeks growing hot. Instead of saying something, he focuses his attention on the sand in front of him and reaches for a piece of plastic waste. Akari watches him for a moment out of the corner of her eye before adding gently, "There are people who do good deeds without wanting to be seen. I think there's something special about that." Her voice is calm and full of warmth, without exerting any pressure. Izuku pauses briefly, unsure of how to react. Finally, without saying a word, he reaches for another piece of rubbish, relieved that she doesn't dwell on it. Akari gives him a gentle smile before turning away to go to the other helpers. At the end of the day, as the sun slowly sets over the sea, Akari is standing near Izuku again. She says goodbye to the helpers in a friendly manner and then stays with him a moment longer. "If you ever feel like having a chat over a cup of coffee, just come by. My Nezamimi Cafe is right on the promenade. You're always welcome." Izuku hastily nods, unable to formulate a proper answer. The next 3 days follow a steady rhythm. Izuku starts as usual with his morning training to strengthen his body and his quirk before heading to the beach after a short rest. Work continues to be exhausting, but every time he sees the progress, he feels a strange sense of satisfaction. More and more volunteers are joining the effort. They are mostly residents and shopkeepers who are happy that the beach is finally looking inviting again. Izuku deliberately stays in the background and concentrates on the work. He speaks only a little, answers questions briefly and takes care not to use his quirk. Nevertheless, he notices that some people, including Akari, are watching him curiously. On the third day, the beach is almost completely cleaned. Izuku is just throwing the last remains of an old fishing net into a container when a shopkeeper says loudly to Akari, "This is incredible. I never thought we could save the beach. People keep coming back, and we owe that to all those who helped here." Izuku hears the words while he concentrates on the next task. A feeling of unease arises in him. He never sought recognition. For him, cleaning up was always just a practical addition to his training. As evening approaches and the last helpers say goodbye, Akari comes to him. Izuku pauses as he sees her approaching. She seems relaxed, but her gaze is firm and direct. "You've been here often in the last few weeks," Akari begins. "I've seen you several times, and not just me. You were the one who started it, right?" Izuku hesitates before nodding slowly. "I just wanted to train and thought I could combine it with cleaning up," he finally admits, averting his gaze. Akari looks at him for a moment, then smiles. "That doesn't change what you've done. You started something that many of us had long since given up on. For most of us here, the beach was lost. The fact that you made it what it used to be has given us all hope." Izuku feels guilty when she says this. He never started cleaning up for selfless reasons. "I really didn't mean it," he mutters softly. "Maybe not," Akari replies gently. "But that doesn't make it any less important." Izuku takes a deep breath before adding quietly, "I'm training to be a hero. I want to go to UA. And I want to be a hero like All Might." Akari looks at him in surprise, then a smile appears on her face. "UA, huh? That explains your determination. I'll be watching your career. You already have your first fan." Izuku blinks in puzzlement and feels the blush rising in his face. "I don't know if I deserve that," he says hesitantly. "Of course you do." Akari crosses her arms and looks at him kindly but firmly. "You've made a bigger impact here than you may realize. And I'm sure you'll achieve much more as a hero." Izuku wants to say something, but the words stick in his throat. Instead, he hastily nods and pulls the brim of his hat deeper over his face. Akari smiles, turns away and walks a few steps towards the promenade. Before she goes any further, she turns around to him again. "And if you ever need a break from training, the invitation to a coffee in my cafe still stands." Izuku watches her go as she walks away. Her words echo in his head. Slowly, a broad grin spreads across his face. It fills him with joy that he has made at least a small difference. Izuku strolls home, slowly pondering where he could train in the future. I need a place where I can use my quirk without being observed. So not anywhere in the city. Then the forest is the only place left. His thoughts drift into the past, to the time when he and Bakugo often explored the forest. It was a long time ago, and the memories are now only vague. Back then, they were still friends. That's the past, Izuku mutters softly. His friend from back then no longer exists. Izuku decides to go to the forest the next day. He is sure to find a quiet place there to carry out the next experiments with his quirk. The next morning, Izuku wakes up as usual. Summer is showing itself from its most intense side in its last few days of vacation. Despite the early morning hours, it is already uncomfortably warm and humid. Nevertheless, Izuku does his running training and then completes his exercises. Although he enjoys the freedom of the summer vacation, he realizes that he clearly prefers the milder weather in spring or fall. After a refreshing shower and breakfast with his mother, he sets off for the forest. Izuku remembers walking this route with his friends when they were kids, exploring everything together. Now those days seem like a different life. Back then, everything was simpler, without quirks, without bullying, just a carefree wonder at the world. Today, he uses the route as part of his training and jogs along the path instead of strolling comfortably. Thanks to his daily running, the route is easy for him to complete, if it weren't for the oppressive heat. Sweat is pouring down his face, and for a moment he wishes he could take off his hat. But that's not an option. Finally, Izuku reaches the edge of the city, completely drenched in sweat. The mountains, where the forests grow, begin there. He greedily takes several gulps from his water bottle. I wish I had brought more water, he mutters wearily. But as soon as he enters the cool shade of the tall hinoki cypress trees, he feels his body slowly relax. The temperature drops noticeably, and Izuku enjoys the relative coolness. A delicate scent of hinoki wood mingles with the earthy smell of damp soil. Along the edges of the path, he notices azalea bushes with their bright colors. The occasional rustling of bamboo gently swaying in the wind is accompanied by the whispering of leaves, creating a peaceful greeting. Izuku notices a narrow stream flowing alongside the path, rippling over smooth stones. It really is beautiful here, he says quietly to himself as he walks deeper into the forest. At first, Izuku follows the well-maintained hiking trails that wind through the forest. The sun's rays, filtering through the dense canopy of leaves, cast dancing patterns on the ground, and the crunching of gravel under his shoes creates a soothing melody. After a while, however, he decides to take a less well-kept side path. This is crisscrossed by gnarled roots and partly covered with moss. With every step, the path becomes more uneven until it is finally little more than a narrow trail. The dense undergrowth almost seems to swallow him up, but Izuku does not let himself be deterred. After a few minutes of laborious progress, the forest opens up before him and he finds himself in a hidden clearing. In the middle of it lies a small lake, its smooth surface glistening like liquid silver in the sunlight. Dragonflies buzz over the water, and the gentle rippling of a small inlet enhances the peaceful atmosphere. Izuku stops and takes in the view. This place is perfect and beautiful, he thinks contentedly. He hasn't seen anyone for almost half an hour, and the seclusion of the forest gives him the feeling that he can practice here completely undisturbed. Izuku claps his hands enthusiastically and says to himself, "Let's see how high I can get with my portals." His gaze falls on a massive nearby tree whose widely branching limbs seem to reach all the way to the sky. The challenge of getting to the very top makes his heart beat faster. He is determined to give it a try. With a focused gaze, Izuku creates the first portal directly in front of him. He places the second one a few meters higher on a sturdy branch of the tree. Without hesitation, he steps through and lands safely. The rough bark of the branch feels firm under his hands, and the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind enhances the feeling of how alive the forest is. Step by step, Izuku repeats the process, placing one portal after another, higher and higher. With each jump, the branches get thinner and the wind blows harder. The increasing height makes the tension inside him rise. Finally, he opens a last portal, just before the top of the tree. The branch he has chosen as a landing point seems narrow and unreliable, and a queasy feeling spreads through him. Slowly Izuku steps through. As he lands on the narrow branch and looks down, a wave of fear and dizziness runs through him. The ground seems far away, and the thought that only a small misstep separates him from a fall makes his hands sweaty. Instinctively, he clings to the trunk of the tree in panic. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all, he mutters, closing his eyes for a moment to calm down. After a few deep breaths, he dares to open his eyes again, this time looking into the distance. The view is breathtaking. The forest stretches out like an endless carpet of dense green, broken up by occasional clearings and narrow, sparkling streams that make their way down into the valley. At the foot of the mountain, he recognizes the city, small and orderly, with its streets filled with tiny vehicles moving back and forth like ants. In the distance, Izuku can also make out the beach where he has spent so much time. The deep blue of the sea merges with the sky on the horizon, while a narrow strip of sand marks the boundary between them. Even from this distance, he can imagine the gentle waves lapping the shore. The contrast between the quiet expanse of the forest and the hustle and bustle of the city fascinates him. "This is incredible," Izuku whispers as he carefully sits down on a wider branch. It feels like he has caught a glimpse of a whole new world. He takes out his notebook. Although his hands are still shaking slightly, he begins to write. "It took me 7 portals to get up there. Aiming became more difficult the higher I got, especially because of the height. The energy consumption was acceptable, but I still have to practice landing more precisely." He pauses, looks into the distance and adds, "From up here, everything seems so small and yet interconnected. The city, the beach, the forest, everything is part of a greater whole." After writing down his thoughts, Izuku gets up carefully. The descent lies ahead of him, and the ground seems far away. This time, however, he can see it clearly. Instead of using several portals as he did on the ascent, he decides to take the direct route. With full concentration, Izuku creates a portal directly in front of him and a second at a safe distance on the forest floor. The turquoise glow fills the air as he checks the stability of the portals. Everything seems to be working as planned. He hesitates for a moment, then takes a deep breath and jumps. With a soft whoosh, he lands safely on the forest floor. His knees are slightly bent to cushion the impact. He stops for a moment, feels the firmness of the ground under his feet, and looks up again. A broad smile spreads across his face. "That worked," he mutters with relief. As he taps the bark off his hands, he thinks about how far he's come already. This challenge scared him at first, but it also showed him how strong and versatile his quirk really is. With renewed vigor, he wonders what he could try next. Izuku's gaze wanders over the clearing until it rests on the shimmering lake. The question arises in his mind as to whether he can also transport liquids through his portals. Determined, he focuses his concentration on the smooth surface of the water. But after just a few attempts, he realizes that it is significantly more difficult to open a portal underwater. He has not yet found a way to create portals in places he cannot see directly. Even blurry areas make it noticeably more difficult to do so. Patiently, he gathers his energy and focuses on the water again. After several attempts, he finally makes a breakthrough. The first portal appears, and shortly thereafter he adds the second. But nothing happens. Izuku scratches his head in confusion. The result is not what he expected. After some thought, he decides to try a different method. He fills one of his empty bottles with water from the lake and opens a new portal, but this time outside the water. With a slight swing, he throws the bottle through the portal and catches it as it flies towards him through the second portal. Like all objects before it, the bottle passes through the portal effortlessly and without any change. So it's not the water itself. That makes sense, after all, there's water in my body too, thinks Izuku, while already planning the next experiment. This time, he opens the bottle and pours the water directly through the portal. To his delight, the liquid emerges from the second portal as expected, but directly into his face. The unexpected splash takes him by surprise, and he gasps briefly. With a broad grin, he wipes the water from his face and begins to summarize his observations, muttering aloud as he hastily writes them down in his notebook. It seems that pressure differences between two portals do not generate any force, Izuku notes. That's why the water doesn't flow through the portal by itself when it's standing vertically in the water. However, if I set the water in motion, it exits the second portal at the same speed. This means that I can't create a strong jet of water by simply opening a portal deep underwater. It's a shame, because that would have been a great way to fight villains. But I could use the portals to drain water in the event of flooding. To do that, I would either have to significantly increase the duration of the portals or further increase their size. The many experiments, coupled with the burning sun, have exhausted Izuku. He decides to take a break and lies down on the grass to rest. The calm of the surroundings has a soothing effect, and Izuku closes his eyes to let the moment sink in. But it is not really quiet. When he listens more closely, he notices the many sounds around him. The gentle wind that caresses the leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the soft lapping of water that makes its way somewhere nearby. For Izuku, this is the essence of summer, a harmonious interplay of warmth and life. The more he concentrates on the sounds, the more intense his perception becomes. It feels as if the world around him is coming to life. Every sound and movement seems to be part of a larger whole, interwoven. In this moment, Izuku feels a deep calm, a rare harmony that completely absorbs him. It is as if he can forget everything else for a brief moment. As he listens to the world around him, Izuku gradually becomes aware of his own pulse, a rhythmic, steady beating. But there is something else. A second pumping, quieter but powerful, draws his attention. It takes a while for him to realize what he is perceiving. He hears his own energy, or at least senses it in a way he has not been aware of before. Izuku has often tried to feel the energy in his body and direct it to different areas. Even as a child, he found it easy to channel it into his hands. But with the appearance of his first portal, he stopped developing this ability. Now, as he lies quietly on the grass, he begins to consciously direct the energy into different parts of his body again. After several minutes, Izuku feels his energy gathering in his muscles. The muscles feel stronger and fresher, but the high energy consumption is unmistakable. Especially today, after the many experiments, he feels a distinct sense of exhaustion. Nevertheless, this discovery gives him the feeling of being a key to something bigger. Izuku resists the urge to jump up immediately and write down his findings in his notebook. But the tension and excitement he feels are slowly causing his concentration to slip away. Confused, he rubs his eyes and tries to relax again. But no matter how hard he tries, the many thoughts in his mind make it impossible for him to calm down. After a few minutes, he gives up. His heart continues to beat fast and his thoughts are racing. A glance at his cell phone tells him that he has been meditating for much longer than he thought. With a deep breath, Izuku finally reaches for his notebook and begins to carefully write down his remaining insights. He adds every little observation before packing up his things. Satisfied, though still inwardly agitated, he makes his way home. At the beginning of February. Izuku has made amazing progress in the last few months. At the beginning of his training, he would never have dreamed of how far he would come. The exercises from All Might's plan, which initially pushed him to his limits, are no longer a challenge. At school, hardly anyone suspects his progress. He deliberately holds back in physical education and just about gets a passable grade. Physically, however, he is superior to most. His progress with his quirk is particularly impressive. Izuku can now create several dozen portals large enough for him to pass through. A trick he has developed helps him to reduce his energy consumption. He has found that his portals require less power when he creates them directly in front of him than when he opens them at a distance. It's faster, too. Izuku suspects that this is because he can focus the energy more precisely when the destination is closer. The spatial distance, on the other hand, requires significantly more control and concentration, which noticeably increases the energy consumption. After some time, Izuku found out that he can throw and move his portals. He creates an unstable portal in his hand and throws it in the desired direction. As soon as the portal hits an object or Izuku concentrates on it, it stabilizes in that position. However, the precision depends heavily on his throwing accuracy. Izuku can only move stable portals slowly, and it requires a lot of concentration. Another discovery has significantly expanded his potential. He can also direct his energy to other parts of his body, for example to his muscles. This allows him to temporarily almost double his strength, but the price is high. This technique consumes enormous amounts of energy and requires much more effort than directing his energy to his hands. Izuku is proud of the fact that he can now double his strength for several minutes, significantly longer if he just increases his power a little. Nevertheless, he uses this ability sparingly and relies on his portals because they offer a better cost-benefit ratio. A painful experience has shown him that he can use his energy not only offensively but also defensively. When Bakugo and his gang caught him once, Izuku panicked and channeled energy into his body. Although the pain remained, the injuries afterwards were less severe than he had expected. The next day, he didn't even have any bruises. This discovery has strengthened his faith in his quirk. To his delight, the beach, which he cleaned for months, remains clean. Every time Izuku walks by, it fills him with pride and a sense of relief. The locals take care to maintain it in its new state. Izuku passes by almost every day, often pausing and occasionally visiting the Nezamini Cafe. He enjoys tea and cake there, and the cheesecake is his favorite. Chika, the owner, insists that the tea and cake are on the house every time. At first, Izuku tried to refuse the offer, but Chika won't budge. Since the beach has been cleaned, her sales have tripled. The other shopkeepers also benefit enormously from it, and the whole area is experiencing an upswing. It is an open secret among the shopkeepers that Izuku started cleaning the beach. Each of them greets him happily when he walks past their shops. A few days ago, his mother threw herself into Izuku's arms, crying, when she came home at night. Fortunately, they were tears of joy. The city council had promoted her for her great idea with the containers. Inko has been appointed deputy head of the Department of Environment and Urban Development. With her new position, she is taking on more responsibility in leading projects to improve the quality of life in her city. Her first big project is the expansion of Takoba Beach. She plans sustainable solutions for waste management and the development of the beach as a tourist and leisure hotspot. Izuku was happy to see his mother so happy and admires her for her determination in taking on this new role. A pleasant side effect is his mother's significantly increased salary. Physically, Izuku now feels well prepared for the UA entrance exam. Combined with his quirk, he believes he has a real chance. Only when it comes to studying for the written part of the exam, he is not sure if he has done enough so far. He is fairly confident that he will pass the Aldera High School leaving exam without any major difficulties, as the school's standards are not particularly high. But the written exam for the UA will be more difficult. The UA is not only the best hero school in Japan, but its general department is also one of the most prestigious in the country. The demands in the normal school subjects are just as high in the hero department as they are in the general department, which means that Izuku must be among the best both physically and in writing. Izuku doesn't want his dream to ultimately fail because of his written performance. So he decides to use the last month to study as much as possible. He reduces his physical training to a morning run and one set of his standard exercises. He doesn't want to cut back on training for his quirk, but decides to push his quirk to the limit in the evening so that he can study at full strength during the day. The school is anything but helpful for Izuku's preparation for the UA, it just wastes his time. Today it feels particularly humiliating. So, some of you still want to become heroes, the class teacher begins, waving a stack of students' future plans. Most of you have now realized that not everyone can become a hero. You have set more realistic goals or decided to try a less demanding hero academy. The teacher's words cause the mood in the class to drop noticeably. Some students look down dejectedly, while others look angry. Then the teacher turns to Bakugo with a broad grin. And then, of course, we have Bakugo. I'm glad to see that you're still aiming for the UA. To be honest, I would have been surprised if you hadn't tried. You're perfectly suited, with your excellent grades and a quirk that's perfect for a hero. Bakugo grins smugly, leans back, puts his feet on the table and announces with an arrogant voice, I will be the first and only one from this school to make the leap to UA. The teacher smiles wryly and adds mockingly, while looking at Izuku, well, Izuku will continue to apply to UA. The class falls silent. For a moment, there is complete silence before Bakugo breaks the tension with a small explosion in the palm of his hand. He turns to Izuku with a scowl, slaps his hand on the desk and causes a small explosion. Izuku falls off his chair in shock while the class breaks out in laughter. Deku, you damn nerd. Bakugo leans threateningly over Izuku, his voice cutting with anger. How many times do I have to hammer it into your skull? You'll never be a hero with your useless quirk. You should finally realize that your place in the world is under my shoes. You're not going to mess up my perfect origin story. With a quick grab, he pulls Izuku up close to him by the collar. The teacher clears his throat loudly. We have a class. It would be better if we started soon. The teacher seems nervous, obviously overwhelmed by the situation that is getting out of hand. At any other school, Bakugo would have been suspended for using his quirk. But here? Izuku sighs inwardly. Bakugo hesitates, apparently processing the teacher's words, and then finally lets Izuku fall back onto his chair. His look speaks volumes. This humiliation is far from over for Izuku. It breaks Izuku's heart that Bakugo repeatedly gets away with such actions. But as so often, Izuku can't do anything about it. When the bell rings for recess, he hurries to get out of the classroom quickly. He desperately needs a better place to be safe from Bakugo and his gang. He knows that Bakugo is just itching to take out his anger on him and show him his place in no uncertain terms. After a few corners, Izuku notices that Bakugo's people are everywhere. They are blocking all the exits on the lower floors and slowly working their way up. Damn, I don't have a chance of getting to the courtyard, Izuku thinks in frustration as he continues to be pushed upwards. It seems like they haven't spotted him yet, but it's only a matter of time. After a while, Izuku is standing in the stairwell in front of the locked door to the roof. That's it, I can't get out of here anymore. He looks around in panic until his gaze falls through the small window in the door to the roof and an idea occurs to him. The sounds of his pursuers are getting louder. Izuku has no time to rethink his plan. He looks through the window and creates a portal on the other side of the door. The footsteps of his pursuers are already echoing ominously close. Quickly, Izuku creates the second portal in front of him and steps through. As soon as he arrives on the roof, Izuku hides so that no one can see him through the window or from the ground. Izuku spends the break on the roof. He listens carefully before carefully peeking through the window to make sure that no one is left in the stairwell. When it seems safe, he repeats his trick and returns to the building through the portal. Izuku hurries to get back to class before the second bell rings. In the hallway outside his class, Izuku stops briefly and glances out the window into the courtyard. His gaze lingers on the small pond where Bakugo sank his notebook so many months ago. An idea shoots through his mind. However, the thought of being caught holds him back for a moment. Time is of the essence, and finally he overcomes his hesitation, quickly looks around, and creates a small portal right in the pond. Izuku makes it to class just in time before the second bell rings and hastily takes a seat. Bakugo glares at him, his face marked by discontent. It is obvious that the fact that Izuku escaped him during recess frustrates him. The last hour of the day drags on endlessly. The teacher, an elderly man with deep wrinkles and a monotone voice, talks about the importance of the economic miracle in post-war Japan, before the quirks appeared. His explanation seems to take forever, while old slides flicker on the screen. Black and white images of factories, tables full of numbers, and a poorly drawn diagram alternate. The class sinks into lethargy, and Izuku desperately tries to stay awake as the minutes drag on like chewing gum. After about half an hour, the perfect moment seems to have arrived. Almost the whole class is in a coma-like state. Some stare blankly at their notebooks, while others rest their heads on their arms and doze off quietly. Even Bakugo seems distracted. His fingers drum impatiently on the tabletop, as if he can't wait for the lesson to end so he can get back to being active. Izuku feels his heart beating faster. He glances unobtrusively around the class. Nobody seems to be paying attention to him. His eyes linger on Bakugo, whose fingers continue to tap impatiently on the table. Now is the perfect moment, Izuku thinks. Slowly, Izuku raises his hand from under the table, as if he were just leaning on his knees. For a brief moment, he hesitates, his thoughts racing. What if Bakugo finds out it was me? Or what if he blames someone else? But then all the constant humiliation flashes through his mind, all the times he had to endure the pain. A surge of determination washes over him. Just this once, he thinks, and takes a deep breath. With extreme concentration, he opens a small portal just above Bakugo's head, just large enough for a single drop. The portal remains for a split second, then closes. The drop hits its target and splashes audibly on Bakugo's hair. Bakugo freezes. For a moment, the world seems to stand still. The water slowly runs down his forehead and drips from his nose onto the tabletop. His facial features darken and his skin turns a deep red color. With an angry roar, he jumps up, making the tabletop tremble in front of him. "Who did this?" he screams, while the entire class winces. The class is startled, awakened from their trance-like state. Everyone stares at Bakugo as he looks around wildly, obviously looking for the culprit. Some students giggle softly, others whisper in confusion, but no one dares to look him directly in the eye. The teacher lazily lifts his head from his papers and shoots Bakugo an indifferent glance. "Sit down, Bakugo, and don't disrupt the lesson." His monotonous voice matches his disinterested expression. He is a veteran of the school and probably the only teacher that Bakugo does not court. Probably only because he is about to retire and doesn't care about anything anymore. Without waiting for an answer, he turns back to his lesson. "That can't be." Bakugo hisses, clenching his fists. "Nobody here is a water freak. What's going on?" His eyes search the room until they finally settle on Izuku. Izuku tries hard to look as uninvolved as possible, staring intently at his notebook. "Deku, it was you, wasn't it?" Bakugo snarls, his eyes sparkling dangerously. Izuku feels his insides raging with adrenaline, but he keeps up his facade. "I'm not crazy about water, Bakugo. You know my quirk is useless. How could it have been me?" His voice remains calm, even though his heart is beating like crazy. Even he can hardly believe what he has just done. Bakugo grits his teeth, but he has no proof. Nobody saw anything, and the class slowly begins to relax again. Some students exchange furtive glances, the corners of their mouths twitching as if they can hardly suppress a smile. But nobody laughs out loud. Bakugo finally sits back down, still grinding his teeth, his hair still slightly damp. The rest of the lesson drags on endlessly. Izuku can feel Bakugo's eyes repeatedly glancing over to him. But he does everything he can to avoid attracting attention. When the lesson is finally over, he's the first to rush for the door. No sooner is he out than he hears Bakugo's angry voice echoing through the hallway. "After him. I swear it was him." Izuku doesn't hesitate for a moment. He starts running, his thoughts racing as he storms through the corridors. Bakugo's gang is close behind him, blocking several possible escape routes. But Izuku concentrates and channels energy into his legs. With increased strength, he storms through the main entrance. For the first time, he feels a sense of accomplishment at standing up to Bakugo, even as panic makes his heart beat faster. "It was worth it," Izuku mutters as he leaves the school gate behind him. But he knows it's not over yet. The thud of heavy footsteps behind him and Bakugo's loud commands prove that the pursuit has only just begun. Izuku sprints on, his enhanced legs carrying him forward with the speed of an athlete. He can feel the energy flowing through his muscles, propelling him, but the consumption is high. He already realizes that he will need to stop the energy supply soon if he does not want to exhaust himself completely. When he stops the energy, his steps will become heavier, and his speed will decrease. But he knows he can't let his quirk be completely exhausted. In that state, he would collapse, leaving his pursuers with free rein. Izuku turns into a narrow side street, and the sounds of his pursuers grow louder. A quick glance back shows that Bakugo is in the lead, followed by two of his more persistent followers. The rest of the pack is panting behind. The chase takes him through narrow streets lined with walls covered in graffiti, past steaming food stalls whose spicy aromas briefly tease his senses, and across empty squares where stray cats scurry between overturned garbage cans. He sprints through small markets where vendors loudly advertise their wares, and has to weave his way past narrow stalls, while the chaos around him adds to the hustle and bustle. The vendors give them confused looks, but Izuku has no time to pay attention to his surroundings. Thanks to his regular running training, he knows the city streets well. He ducks under a clothes rail and jumps over stacked boxes, but Bakugo is slowly catching up. "Think, Izuku, think," he mutters, panting, as the winding stone walls of a Japanese suburb appear before him. The narrow lanes with their high walls seem to offer the perfect opportunity to shake off his pursuers. He turns into one of the alleys and glances back. Only Bakugo and two of his followers are still close behind him, while the others have apparently given up. Izuku spots a fenced-in carport ahead of him, and a plan forms in his head in a flash. As he runs past it, he pretends to look back over his shoulder, but in reality he opens a portal inside the carport. He takes care to place it so that his pursuers won't notice it unless they turn around as well. Izuku sprints on and turns sharply into the next alley. Once he is sure that there is no one else on the street, he opens another portal right in front of him in the few seconds before Bakugo and the others reach the corner and rushes through. As soon as Izuku reaches the carport, he makes the portals disappear and immediately hides behind a car so that he can no longer be seen from the street. He gasps for air, his heart beating like a sledgehammer. While he tries to catch his breath, he remains as still as possible. Bakugo and his thugs are still close by. Izuku hears Bakugo's angry voice and the stomping of feet. "Where is he?" Bakugo bellows. Explosions pop in the air, and the acrid smell of burnt material hits Izuku's nose. "Search him." Bakugo barks, and Izuku hears footsteps coming from various directions, accompanied by the rustling of bushes in the front yards. One of them comes uncomfortably close to Izuku's hiding place. The crunching footsteps on the gravel seem to fade away right above him. One more step and he would be discovered. Izuku holds his breath, his heart beating so loudly that he fears it could give him away. But before the situation can escalate, the angry grumbling of a woman cuts through the tense silence of the neighborhood. "Get out of my garden, you little brat, before I call the police," she yells in a voice that echoes loudly through the narrow streets and freezes even the most persistent pursuers for a moment. That was Izuku's salvation. Bakugo's companion looks uncertainly in the direction of the shouting, hesitates briefly, and then stops the search to run back to Bakugo. Izuku hardly dares to move, but a tiny, relieved smile crosses his face. Bakugo lets out a menacing growl, followed by another explosion. Small cracks appear in the walls surrounding the narrow streets. "This isn't over yet, Deku," Bakugo hisses, his voice shaking with rage. "I'll get you." Izuku presses himself closer to the car as the footsteps of his pursuers slowly fade into the distance. He waits a few minutes until absolute silence has set in before he carefully straightens up. His legs tremble and every step hurts, but he quietly moves away in the opposite direction. Despite his exhaustion, he feels a triumphant sense of relief. Today he has made it. The days until the exam fly by. Izuku follows his training plan with discipline, but focuses on studying as much as possible. He has made it his personal goal to beat Bakugo in the written exam. During his morning runs, he deliberately avoids all paths where he might encounter Bakugo or his clique. At school, he stays alert and watches their every move. Nevertheless, he has to use his quirk several times to escape them. The tension is always with him, but it also drives him. Every day he manages to avoid Bakugo, he feels like he's getting stronger, not just physically but mentally too. The upcoming exam is all he focuses on now. It's his chance to finally prove that he's more than the useless Deku Bakugo thinks he is.